The New Mexico night hung heavy with stars, their cold light barely illuminating the dense forest below. In the shadows between ancient pines, Abigail Hayes ran with the desperate energy of prey. Her once fine dress now hung in tatters, caught on brambles and stained with dirt and blood. Each labored breath fogged in the cool mountain air as she pushed forward her body, screaming for rest she couldn't afford. Behind her, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Boots crushing undergrowth, voices calling to one another in the darkness. 3 men, armed and relentless, had been tracking her since sundown. She'd managed to stay ahead, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Abigail's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling down a short embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to rise, only to collapse again. Panic surged as she dragged herself behind a fallen log, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle her ragged breathing. Footsteps approached, slow and confident now. A lantern's glow cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest floor. "We know you're here, Miss Hayes," a voice called out, cultured and cold. "This little chase has gone on long enough. Mr. Kingston is most displeased with your behavior." Abigail pressed herself further into the shadows, fighting the urge to run. She'd seen what happened to those who defied Kingston. The children's faces flashed in her mind, pale, frightened, resigned to their fate in that cellar. She couldn't end up like them. She wouldn't. The lantern light stopped just feet away. Abigail could see polished boots through the rotting wood of the log. "There you are," the voice said softly. The log was suddenly kicked aside, leaving her exposed in the dirt. Abigail scrambled backward until her shoulders hit rough stone, the edge of a cliff. Nowhere left to run. 3 men formed a semicircle around her, their faces hard in the lantern light. "Please," she whispered, though she knew it was useless. Men like these had no capacity for mercy. The leader, a lean man with cold eyes, reached inside his coat. "Mr. Kingston sends his regrets, Miss Hayes, but you've seen too much." Abigail closed her eyes, waiting for the end. A shot rang out, echoing across the canyon. Abigail flinched but felt no pain. When she opened her eyes, the leader was staring at his companion, who now lay motionless on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Before anyone could react, a second shot cracked through the night, and the other henchman dropped. The leader spun wildly, drawing his pistol. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness, his composure shattered. No answer came, but the whisper of wind through pine needles. The man backed away, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Suddenly he turned and fled into the forest, abandoning both lantern and prey. Silence descended, broken only by Abigail's shallow breathing. She remained frozen, uncertain if her unknown savior posed an equal threat. A figure emerged from the tree line, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the silent grace of a predator. The Winchester rifle in his hand still carried the faint scent of gunpowder. His face, partially obscured by several days' worth of beard, belonged to a man somewhere in his late 40s, weathered by sun and hardship. But it was his eyes that held Abigail's attention. Pale blue, sharp with intelligence, and carrying a weight of experiences she couldn't begin to fathom. He approached cautiously, as one might a wounded animal, and knelt several feet away. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. Abigail studied him, trying to determine if she'd escaped one danger only to encounter another. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Name's Jackson Cole," he replied, setting his rifle aside in a gesture of peace. "My ranch is about 2 miles south of here. I heard the shots." "Why did you help me?" Abigail asked, still wary. Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a flicker of old pain quickly suppressed. "Couldn't just ride past," he said simply. Abigail felt consciousness beginning to slip away, the adrenaline that had kept her going now ebbing like the tide. She looked into the stranger's eyes one last time, finding no malice there, only a guarded compassion. "I'm filthy," she whispered, tears suddenly blurring her vision, inside and out. Darkness claimed her before she could see his reaction. Jackson Cole remained still for a long moment, her words hanging in the night air between them. Around him, the forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. 3 men dead or fled, a brutalized woman and him. A man who'd sworn to leave violence behind. "Walk away," a voice whispered in his mind. "This isn't your concern. Ride to town. Tell the sheriff. Let the law handle it." But even as these thoughts formed, Jackson was already removing his duster, gently wrapping it around the woman's battered form. His decision wasn't born of heroism or chivalry, but of something simpler, more fundamental. The basic decency that had survived within him despite everything. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, as if suffering had hollowed her out, leaving only a fragile shell. Her head lolled against his chest, a small whimper escaping her lips, despite her unconsciousness. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he wasn't certain that was true for either of them. Jackson's sorrel mare waited patiently where he'd left her tethered to a pine. With practiced care, he secured the unconscious woman before mounting behind her, supporting her limp form with one arm while guiding his horse with the other. The journey back to his ranch was slow and careful. The moon had begun its descent toward the western mountains by the time the weathered cabin came into view. A small structure with a separate stable, chicken coop, and corral. A vegetable garden struggled against the drought behind the cabin, protected by a windbreak of salvaged lumber. It wasn't prosperity, but it was honest living far removed from the blood money of his former profession. As Jackson approached his home, a sense of disquiet settled over him. For 10 years he'd lived in solitude, avoiding entanglements with the world he'd left behind. Now, with this wounded stranger, he was inviting complications he couldn't begin to predict. Yet something about the woman's broken state, about the desperation in her eyes before she'd collapsed, told him this wasn't a choice at all, but an obligation to whatever remnant of humanity still resided within him. With careful movements, Jackson carried her into the cabin, laying her gently on his bed. He worked methodically, heating water on the wood stove, gathering clean rags, and the small supply of medical items he kept on hand. The routine was familiar from his days as a scout during the war, when field medicine had often fallen to him in the absence of proper doctors. As he cleaned her wounds, Jackson catalogued her injuries with clinical detachment. The violence done to her went beyond the cuts and bruises visible on her skin. Her wrists bore rope burns, her arms needle marks. Whoever had held her had done so for some time, and with cruel purpose. Anger, cold and familiar, stirred in Jackson's chest. He tamped it down. That path led to darkness he had fought 10 years to escape. Yet, as he bandaged a particularly deep cut on the woman's arm, his hands trembled with suppressed rage. Some sins, he reflected grimly, deserved judgment more than forgiveness. With the woman's wounds cleaned and bandaged, Jackson covered her with a quilt and stepped outside onto the cabin's small porch. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of amber and gold, a beautiful conclusion to a day marked by ugliness. He lit a cigarette, a rare indulgence, and listened to the evening sounds of the desert awakening as the heat relented. From inside he could hear the soft sounds of the woman's troubled sleep, small whimpers and unintelligible murmurs, not screams or shouts, but the quieter sounds of a shattered soul trying to find its rhythm again. Jackson gazed up at the emerging stars, their cold light offering no answers to his unspoken questions. What had happened to her? Who were these men pursuing her? And most troublingly, what responsibility did he now bear for her fate? "What would you have me do, Rebecca?" he whispered to the gathering darkness. His late wife had been gone 12 years now, yet he still found himself seeking her counsel in moments of doubt. Rebecca had been his moral compass, his link to humanity during his darkest days as a bounty hunter. Her death, along with their daughter Hannah's, had nearly destroyed him, sent him on a 3-year spiral of violence and revenge that had only ended when he realized how far from her ideals he had strayed. The stars offered no reply, but as Jackson stood in contemplation, a gentle breeze stirred unexpected in the still evening air. It brushed against his face like a caress, stirring memories of Rebecca's touch. For just a moment, he could almost feel her presence, as real and substantial as the wooden railing beneath his hands. The sensation passed quickly, but it left Jackson with a sense of certainty. The woman asleep in his cabin had been placed in his path for a reason. Perhaps this was his chance for redemption, to save a life rather than take one. With newfound resolve, Jackson returned to the cabin. By lantern light, he wrote a brief note to Pastor Walter Bennett, the only person in these parts who knew his true identity and past. The message was simple: "Found a wounded woman. Need your counsel. Come when you can." J. At first light, he would ride to the edge of town and find one of the local boys to deliver it. For now he settled into the wooden chair beside the bed, Winchester across his lap, prepared for a long night of watchful vigil. Dawn brought no improvement in the woman's condition. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin hot with fever. Jackson bathed her forehead with cool water and forced small amounts of broth between her parched lips. By mid-morning, he knew he needed help beyond his limited medical knowledge. Reluctantly leaving the woman alone, Jackson rode to the outskirts of Redemption, the small town that served as the only civilization within 30 miles of his ranch. He avoided the main street instead, finding young Tommy Wilson cleaning stables behind his father's general store. "Need you to take a message to Pastor Bennett," Jackson said, pressing the folded note and a silver dollar into the boy's hand. "It's important, Tommy. Just for the pastor's eyes." "Yes, sir, Mr. Cole," the boy replied, eyes wide at the generous payment. "I'll take it straight away. And Tommy," Jackson added, his voice dropping lower, "no need to mention to anyone you saw me today." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding, without being told that discretion was part of what he was being paid for. Jackson watched him dart away toward the church at the far end of town before turning his horse back toward the ranch, pausing only to purchase medical supplies and fever powder from the Chinese apothecary, who asked no questions and remembered no faces. When Jackson returned to the cabin, he found the woman awake, though clearly disoriented. She had dragged herself from the bed and now sat huddled in the corner of the room, clutching a kitchen knife with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes, wide with fear, tracked his every movement. "I won't hurt you," Jackson said softly, keeping his distance. "You're safe here." The woman didn't respond, but her grip on the knife loosened slightly. Jackson moved slowly, placing the medical supplies on the table before backing away again. "You've been hurt," he continued. "You need rest and medicine. Will you let me help you?" After a long moment, the woman gave a barely perceptible nod. Her gaze remained wary, but desperation and weakness overcame fear. Jackson helped her back to the bed, administered the fever powder with water, and redressed her wounds. All the while, he maintained a respectful distance whenever possible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Thank you," she whispered as he finished, her voice hoarse from disuse or screaming. Jackson couldn't tell which. "Rest now," he replied simply. "I'll be close, if you need anything." He moved to the chair by the window, giving her space while keeping watch. Outside, the New Mexico sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth and shimmering off distant rock formations. "Where am I?" the woman asked after a while. "My ranch," Jackson answered. "About 30 miles southwest of Redemption. You're in New Mexico territory." She absorbed this information with a slight frown. "How long have I been here?" "Found you last night. You've been unconscious most of the time since then." The woman closed her eyes briefly, as if assembling fragments of memory. "Those men—" "Two dead," Jackson stated matter-of-factly. "One ran." A shudder passed through her, though whether from relief or horror, Jackson couldn't tell. "My name is Abigail," she offered after another silence. "Abigail Hayes." Jackson nodded, accepting the introduction without pushing for more information. The woman, Abigail, clearly needed time. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Cole," she said. Jackson merely inclined his head, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You should eat something," he said, rising to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. As he worked, he felt Abigail's eyes following him, assessing. There was intelligence in that gaze despite her weakened state. Not just fear, but calculation. The look of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. "You don't seem surprised," she said suddenly. Jackson paused in his task. "About what?" "Finding a woman being hunted in the wilderness. Saving her from armed men. Most people would have questions." Jackson returned to stirring the beans. "Most people haven't seen what I've seen." "And what's that, Mr. Cole?" He turned to face her, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor, testing him, probing for information. "The worst people can do to each other," he answered simply, "and occasionally the best." Abigail held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. Something had passed between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that both carried secrets they weren't ready to share. The afternoon passed quietly. Abigail ate sparingly but accepted medicine without resistance. Her fever remained, though it seemed less severe. As daylight began to fade, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Jackson to the window, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he instructed Abigail, moving to the door. The rider was Pastor Walter Bennett, his ancient mule wheezing from the journey. At 68, the pastor was still robust, his white beard and weathered face giving him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet. Before finding God, Bennett had been a cavalry sergeant, a fact evident in his straight posture and assessing gaze as he dismounted. "Jackson!" he greeted, his voice deep and resonant. "Pastor," Jackson replied with a nod toward the cabin. "She's awake, but still weak." The pastor followed Jackson into the cabin, removing his hat respectfully as he entered. Abigail was sitting up in bed, watching their entrance with cautious eyes. "This is Pastor Bennett," Jackson explained. "He's a friend. He can be trusted." The pastor approached slowly, pulling a chair beside the bed but leaving comfortable space between them. "I'm pleased to see you recovering, my dear," he said gently. "Would you feel comfortable telling us your name?" Abigail hesitated, her gaze flicking between the two men. "Abigail Hayes," she finally said. "Miss Hayes," the pastor acknowledged with a small nod. "You're among friends here. Jackson has told me how he found you, but nothing more. Would you care to share what happened?" Abigail's hands twisted in the quilt covering her lap. I don't remember much," she admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "I was teaching. I'm a governess for a family in Chicago, the Kingstons. Then, nothing clear, just fragments. Men taking me, a dark room." Her breathing quickened. "Pain, so much pain." Pastor Bennett raised a calming hand. "It's all right, Miss Hayes. The mind sometimes protects us from what it cannot bear to remember." While they spoke, Jackson had noticed something protruding from the pocket of his duster, which now hung beside the door. He retrieved a folded piece of paper yellowed and creased from handling. Opening it revealed handwriting elegant, but hurried in what appeared to be journal form. "Is this yours?" he asked, turning toward Abigail. She frowned, shaking her head slowly. "I don't know. I don't remember writing anything." Jackson handed her the page. "It was in your pocket when I found you." Abigail accepted the paper with trembling fingers. As she read, the color drained from her face. "Reeves knows everything. The judge is covering up. Garrett is the key." She recited, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "I don't understand. I don't remember writing this." Jackson had gone completely still, his face carefully neutral despite the shock coursing through him. Reeves. His real name, Jackson Reeves, a name he hadn't used in 10 years. A name no one in this territory should know. Pastor Bennett, noting Jackson's reaction smoothly, redirected the conversation. "Does the name Garrett mean anything to you, Miss Hayes?" At the name, Abigail visibly flinched, though confusion remained in her eyes. "I don't know, but it feels wrong, dangerous." Jackson and the pastor exchanged a significant look. Whatever had happened to Abigail Hayes went beyond a simple assault. The men in the forest. The cryptic note, her selective memory loss, all pointed to something more sinister. "You're safe here for now," Jackson assured her, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Rest. Recover your strength. Memory often returns with time." After ensuring Abigail had food and water within reach, the two men stepped outside to speak privately. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as they walked toward the corral. "This is trouble, Jackson," Bennett said without preamble. "Deep trouble." "I know," Jackson replied, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "But what was I supposed to do? Leave her there?" The pastor sighed heavily. "No, that wouldn't be your way, despite what you'd have people believe." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The note mentions a judge. Could be Judge Sullivan in town. He's the only judge for 100 miles. Respectable man," Jackson observed. "Church-going, generous to widows and orphans by all accounts." "Yes," Bennett agreed, his tone thoughtful, very careful about his public image. He turned to face Jackson directly. "I'll make some discreet inquiries. In the meantime, keep her hidden. If what she witnessed was important enough for men to die over others, we'll be looking for her." As the pastor prepared to leave, he placed a weathered hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Be careful, old friend. You left that life behind for good reason." "I'm just helping a wounded woman," Jackson protested. Bennett's expression remained grave. "The path to hell is often paved with good intentions, and the path back to your old ways might be shorter than you think." With those sobering words, the pastor departed, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and an unconscious woman who carried secrets dangerous enough to kill for. Back inside the cabin, Jackson found Abigail examining the journal page again, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're Jackson Reeves, aren't you?" she asked without looking up. The question hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he considered denial, but something in her tone told him it would be futile. "I was," he admitted finally. "A long time ago." Abigail raised her eyes to meet his. "Why does that name appear in a note I supposedly wrote, but don't remember writing?" Jackson moved to the window, scanning the horizon out of habit before answering. "I don't know. 10 years ago I left that name behind." became Jackson Cole. No one here knows me as Reeves. Except Pastor Bennett. Except him, Jackson conceded. Abigail set the paper aside, wincing as pain shot through her ribs. Mr. Cole, or Reeves, I need to understand what's happening. These gaps in my memory, they terrify me. Jackson turned back to face her. Tell me what you do remember. Start from the beginning. Abigail closed her eyes, concentrating. I was hired by the Kingston family in Chicago 6 months ago. Harrison Kingston is a prominent banker. His wife, Eliza, active in society. They have 3 children I was employed to educate. She opened her eyes, frustration evident. Everything was normal proper. Then, nothing. Just fragments that don't make sense. And the name Garrett, the judge, she shook her head. Nothing clear, just a feeling of dread when I hear them. Jackson studied her, weighing his next words carefully. The pastor mentioned Judge Sullivan is holding a special charity auction in 6 days. Very exclusive. Only the wealthy and connected are invited. An auction? Abigail repeated, something flickering in her eyes. Recognition quickly submerged beneath confusion. Yes, supposedly to raise funds for orphans and widows. Abigail suddenly clutched her head, a small cry escaping her lips. Jackson moved quickly to her side, but stopped short of touching her. What is it? He asked. Children, she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. I remember children crying in the dark. The next 3 days passed quietly as Abigail's physical condition improved. The fever broke, her wounds began to heal, and color returned to her gaunt features. She grew stronger, moving from bed to chair, then carefully around the cabin. Jackson kept his distance while remaining attentive to her needs, preparing simple meals, providing clean clothes, left behind by the occasional female travelers Pastor Bennett had sent his way over the years. On the 4th morning, Jackson found Abigail standing unsteadily before the small mirror hanging near the wash basin. She was attempting to brush her matted hair, wincing as the comb caught in the tangles. Let me help, Jackson offered, approaching slowly. Abigail tensed but handed him the comb after a moment's hesitation. Jackson worked with surprising gentleness, carefully teasing out the knots without causing pain. His large hands, capable of such violence in another life, moved with delicate precision. You've done this before, Abigail observed, watching him in the mirror. A shadow passed across Jackson's features. For my wife, he said after a moment. She had beautiful hair, long like yours, dark as a raven's wing. What happened to her? Abigail asked softly. Jackson's hands stilled momentarily. She died 12 years ago, along with our daughter. The words were clipped final. A door firmly closed. Abigail didn't press further. When Jackson finished, she thanked him with a small nod, their eyes meeting briefly in the mirror. An understanding passed between them, respect for boundaries, for wounds too deep to expose to casual examination. That evening, as they sat before the fire, sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew, Abigail spoke of her life before the gaps in her memory. She was the daughter of a literature professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, educated beyond what was common for women of her time. After her father's death, she had taken a position as governess to the Kingston family's 3 children. They seemed the perfect family, she said, her gaze distant as she recalled the past. Mr. Kingston is a prominent banker. Mrs. Kingston active in society and charity work. The children were well behaved, if a bit sheltered. Her brow furrowed. But there was something off about the household, rules that made no sense, rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, conversations that stopped when I approached. When did you disappear? Jackson asked. Abigail shook her head in frustration. I don't know. The last clear memory I have is teaching Alice, the youngest, her letters in early April. Then, fragments. A cellar, I think. Men I didn't know. Pain. She set down her bowl, appetite gone. And fear. Constant fear. That night, Abigail's nightmares began in earnest. Jackson woke to her screams, finding her tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, fighting invisible assailants. He approached cautiously, speaking her name, until she woke fully wild-eyed and trembling. "The children," she gasped, clutching at Jackson's arm with surprising strength. "In the basement. So many children crying in the dark." "It was just a dream," Jackson soothed, though doubt colored his words. Abigail's eyes cleared, the fog of nightmare receding. "No," she whispered. "A memory. I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If her fragmented recollections were indeed memories rather than nightmare fabrications, the danger to Abigail, and now to Jackson by association, was far greater than either had initially realized. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jackson was chopping wood when he heard approaching hoofbeats. He signaled to Abigail, who was hanging laundry, and she quickly retreated inside. Jackson positioned himself casually beside the woodpile, where the Winchester leaned within easy reach. The lone rider who appeared around the bend was not, as Jackson had feared, one of the town's deputies or a hired gun. Instead, it was Tommy Wilson, the boy who had delivered his message to Pastor Bennett. The youth looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as he approached. "Mr. Cole!" Tommy called, reining in his pony. "Pastor sent me with this. Said it's urgent." Jackson accepted the folded newspaper and small sealed note, pressing another silver dollar into the boy's palm. "You weren't followed." Tommy shook his head emphatically. "No, sir. Came the back way like the pastor said. Nobody saw. Good lad. Now ride home, and if anyone asks, I was collecting eagle feathers in the high country." Tommy grinned with a conspiratorial nod. "Yes, sir." As the boy galloped away, Jackson unfolded the newspaper. The Chicago Tribune, dated 3 weeks earlier. His blood ran cold as he read the headline, "Prominent Educator's Daughter, Missing, Foul Play, Suspected." Beneath it was a photograph of Abigail Hayes, looking considerably healthier and well-dressed, but unmistakably the same woman now recovering in his cabin. The accompanying article detailed how Abigail had vanished from her position as governess to the Kingston family, one of Chicago's most respected households. A substantial reward was offered for information leading to her safe return. More disturbing was Pastor Bennett's accompanying note. "Judge Sullivan has been asking questions about a missing woman. Strange men have been seen riding with local deputies near your property. Be on guard. Destroy this note." Jackson returned to the cabin, finding Abigail watching anxiously from the window. Wordlessly, he handed her the newspaper. She sank into a chair as she read, one hand rising to cover her mouth. 3 weeks, she murmured. "I've been missing for 3 weeks." Her fingers traced the photograph. "I look like a stranger to myself." "The Kingstons are offering a reward for your return," Jackson noted, studying her reaction carefully. Abigail's expression darkened. "Don't trust them," she said with surprising vehemence. "I don't remember why, but I know that much." She looked up at Jackson, her eyes suddenly clear and focused. "I think they're the ones who did this to me." Jackson nodded, slowly processing this new information alongside Pastor Bennett's warning. "We need to get you stronger," he said finally. "And I need to teach you how to defend yourself." The next week established a new routine. Mornings were devoted to Abigail's physical recovery. Walking progressively longer distances, performing strengthening exercises Jackson remembered from his army days. Afternoons were spent on practical survival skills: how to shoot, how to move silently through terrain, how to identify potential threats. Abigail proved an apt pupil, her natural intelligence complementing a previously hidden determination. Despite her still healing injuries, she pushed herself relentlessly, as if driven by some internal urgency she couldn't fully articulate. During their lessons, Jackson revealed more of his own past than he had intended. Not everything, never the full extent of his sins, but enough for Abigail to understand he was no simple rancher. "I was a scout in the war," he explained one evening as they cleaned their guns by firelight. "Learned tracking, shooting, surviving. Afterward, when there were no more battles to fight, I found I had skills that certain people valued." "You became a bounty hunter," Abigail stated, no question in her voice. "Yes," Jackson admitted, no point in denying it. "Men with prices on their heads, wanted dead or alive, and dead paid the same with less trouble." Abigail absorbed this without visible reaction. "And then," she prompted after a moment. "Then I met Rebecca," Jackson said, his voice softening slightly. "She was a nurse during the war, gentle soul but fierce in her convictions. Somehow she saw something in me worth saving." A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. "We married, had a daughter, Hannah. I tried to quit the life, took only contracts for men who truly deserved judgment." His expression darkened. "But violence follows violence. One night, while I was away tracking a murderer, men came to our home. A robbery, they said later. Rebecca tried to stop them. Or maybe they just wanted no witnesses." His voice faltered. "By the time I returned, they were both gone." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. Jackson nodded acknowledgement of her sympathy as familiar guilt and grief washed through him. "I spent 3 years hunting the men responsible. Found them too, one by one." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "But vengeance didn't bring them back. Just stained my soul darker." "So you came here," Abigail concluded, "to escape." "To atone," Jackson corrected, "though I'm not sure such sins can be washed clean." They lapsed into silence, the confession hanging between them like wood smoke, acrid but gradually dissipating into the night air. Finally, Abigail spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps that's why Rebecca led me to you. So you could save someone instead of hunting them." Jackson looked up sharply, struck by how closely her words echoed his own thoughts that first night. Before he could respond, a sound outside froze them both. The distant but unmistakable approach of multiple horses. Moving with practiced efficiency, Jackson extinguished the lamp, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the cabin. He gestured for Abigail to move away from the windows as he retrieved the Winchester and peered carefully through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders approached from the main trail, moving slowly, deliberately. Even in the dim moonlight, Jackson could tell they were armed. His jaw tightened as he recognized their purposeful formation. Not casual visitors, but men with clear intent. "Take this," he whispered, pressing the Colt revolver into Abigail's hands. "Remember what I taught you. If anyone but me comes through that door, shoot center mass, and don't hesitate." Abigail nodded grimly, checking the cylinder with steady hands that betrayed none of the fear evident in her eyes. Jackson slipped out the back door, circling wide to approach the riders from behind. The night was his ally, the terrain his advantage. As he moved silently through the shadows, memories of countless similar maneuvers surfaced unbidden: the stalking of prey, the cold calculation of angles and opportunities. No, not prey. Not this time. These were threats to someone under his protection. This wasn't hunting, it was defense. The distinction felt important, though Jackson knew the techniques remained the same. The riders had stopped 100 yards from the cabin, conferring in low voices. Jackson crept closer, staying downwind until their words became audible. "Sure this is the place?" One man was asking, his accent marking him as Eastern, out of place in this territory. "Sullivan's Ranch," another confirmed. "Keeps to himself, but the pastor visits regular." "Judge said to be careful," the third man warned. "If the woman's here, Sullivan might be harboring her knowingly. Man has a reputation, though it's old." Jackson's blood ran cold. They knew his name, his real name, not the Jackson Cole identity he'd carefully cultivated for a decade. And they were connected to the judge. Pastor Bennett's warning had been well-founded. Making a swift decision, Jackson circled back to the cabin, slipping inside to find Abigail exactly where he'd left her revolver trained steadily on the door. "3 men," he whispered. "Looking for you," mentioned a judge. Abigail's face paled, but her hands remained steady. "What do? We leave. Now." Jackson moved with purpose, gathering essential supplies into saddlebags. "They're not rushing in, which means they're not certain you're here. We use that hesitation." Within minutes, they had packed the bare necessities: food, ammunition, basic medical supplies, and bedrolls. Jackson led Abigail to the stable behind the cabin, where they silently saddled 2 horses, his sorrel mare for him, and a steady buckskin gelding for Abigail. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say. And if there's trouble, ride east toward the mountains," Jackson instructed as they mounted. "There's a line shack in Cottonwood Canyon. You'll find supplies there." Abigail nodded, her face set with determination, despite the fear evident in her eyes. Jackson led them out the back of the stable, away from the cabin, using a dry creek bed to mask their departure. Behind them, the cabin stood as they'd left it. No fires doused, no obvious signs of hasty departure. Let the men waste time searching empty rooms while they gained distance. They rode through the night, Jackson setting a careful pace that prioritized stealth over speed. He led them on a circuitous route, crossing rocky ground where horses would leave no tracks, doubling back occasionally to ensure they weren't followed. Abigail kept up without complaint, though Jackson could see the toll the journey was taking on her still-recovering body. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, they reached a sheltered canyon, a place known to few, with a small spring and enough forage for the horses. Jackson helped Abigail dismount, noting her grimace of pain as her feet touched the ground. "We'll rest here today," he decided. "Travel again tonight." "Will they follow us?" Abigail asked, sinking gratefully onto a flat rock near the spring. Jackson unsaddled the horses before answering. "Yes," he said finally. "But they'll have to pick up our trail first, and I've made that difficult." As Abigail slept fitfully beneath a makeshift shelter of pine boughs, Jackson kept watch Winchester across his lap. His mind churned with questions and half-formed plans. Who exactly was pursuing Abigail? What had she witnessed that warranted such effort to silence her? And how long could they stay ahead of hunters who clearly had resources and information? More troubling was the mention of his real name. Few people knew Jackson Cole had once been Jackson Reeves, one of the most feared bounty hunters in the territories. Fewer still knew he had settled in this remote corner of New Mexico. Someone with considerable influence had connected those dots. Someone like a judge with access to old wanted posters and territorial records. When Abigail woke mid-afternoon, Jackson shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack with her. As they ate, he broached the subject that had been troubling him. "The men knew my name," he said. "My real name from before. Abigail looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means whoever is after you has connections. Deep ones. Jackson studied her face carefully. I need you to try to remember, Abigail. What did you see? What could be worth killing for? Abigail closed her eyes, frustration evident in the tightening of her jaw. I try, but it's like grasping at smoke. I get flashes. A cellar door, children crying, a ledger with names. She opened her eyes, meeting Jackson's gaze directly. And fear. So much fear, it chokes me. Jackson nodded slowly. Fear can be the mind's way of protecting itself. He hesitated, then added, In my experience, though, the only way past such fear is through it. That evening, as they prepared to continue their journey, Abigail suddenly clutched Jackson's arm, her face draining of color. Kingston, she whispered the name, emerging like a revelation. I remember now. Not everything, but enough. Her eyes were wide with horror. The children in the basement. They weren't the Kingston children. They were merchandise. Jackson's blood ran cold. Merchandise. Abigail nodded, her expression sickened. Immigrants. Orphans' children no one would miss. Cleaned up, taught basic manners, then sold. To mines, to houses of ill repute, to wealthy families wanting servants without questions. Her breathing quickened. I found the cellar by accident. Saw the children. Saw the ledger with names and prices. And the judge, Jackson prompted gently. How does he connect? Abigail's brow furrowed in concentration. He approved the paperwork somehow, made it legal. Adoption records, work permits. Her eyes widened suddenly. Judge Sullivan. That was the name on the documents. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more disturbing than Jackson had anticipated. Child trafficking involving one of Chicago's elite families and a territorial judge. No wonder men were willing to kill to keep such operations secret. We need to move, Jackson said, securing the last of their supplies. Head deeper into the mountains, where they'll have trouble following. As they mounted, Abigail's expression hardened with newfound resolve. Jackson, she said quietly, if what I'm remembering is true, there are children suffering while we run. Children no one is looking for. Jackson met her gaze, recognizing the moral challenge in her words. He had spent 10 years seeking personal redemption in isolation. Now fate, or providence, had placed before him an opportunity for more meaningful atonement to actually save lives, rather than merely abstain from taking them. First, we get you safe, he said finally. Then we figure out how to stop them. They rode into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the simple life Jackson had built and heading toward a confrontation he had spent a decade avoiding. Behind them, the stars emerged one by one, cold witnesses to the small drama unfolding beneath their ancient light. And somewhere in that vast, indifferent sky, Jackson imagined Rebecca, watching as well, perhaps guiding him toward the redemption he had so long sought. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the dawn sky, their jagged peaks painted in hues of rose and gold that belied the harshness of the terrain. After 3 days of hard riding through increasingly remote country, Jackson and Abigail had reached the high wilderness where few men ventured by choice. They made camp in a secluded box canyon, its narrow entrance easily defensible. Its high walls offering protection from both elements and prying eyes. A small stream provided fresh water, and the scattered pine trees yielded enough deadfall for cooking fires that produced minimal smoke. Abigail had proven remarkably resilient throughout their flight. Despite her still healing wounds and the rigors of hard travel, She maintained a quiet determination that Jackson found himself admiring. The fragile woman he'd found beneath the juniper tree was transforming before his eyes, fear giving way to resolve, victimhood to purpose. "Your shooting has improved," Jackson observed as they shared a breakfast of coffee and trail biscuits. The previous evening, he had set up empty cans for her to practice with the Colt, and her accuracy had increased noticeably. "I had good motivation," Abigail replied with a hint of grim humor. "Nothing focuses the mind quite like people wanting to kill you." Jackson nodded, understanding all too well. Fear can be useful that way if you don't let it master you. As the sun climbed higher, Jackson tended to the horses, while Abigail reorganized their dwindling supplies. The domestic routine felt strangely comforting amid their dire circumstances, a small pocket of normalcy in lives that had become anything but ordinary. "I've been remembering more," Abigail said, suddenly pausing in her task of rolling the bedding. "About the Kingstons, about what I saw." Jackson moved to sit across from her, giving her his full attention. "Tell me." Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she set aside the blanket. "The children were kept in a cellar beneath the carriage house. Clean enough, fed enough, but locked in. 10 of them, when I found them, ages 5 to 12, perhaps different nationalities." Her voice grew distant, eyes unfocused, as if seeing the scene again. They'd been taught to speak simple English phrases, to behave properly at table, to address adults as "sir" and "ma'am." She drew a shaky breath. "I discovered them by accident. Was looking for a book I'd left in the carriage, heard crying. Found a door that should have been locked, but wasn't." Her expression hardened. "Mr. Kingston found me there." I'd never seen such rage beneath the polite exterior. He claimed they were orphans waiting for proper placement, that his wife's charity work sometimes required temporary housing. "You didn't believe him," Jackson stated rather than asked. "I pretended to," Abigail corrected. "Apologized for overstepping. But that night I searched his study, found account books, children listed like livestock. Purchase prices, maintenance costs, expected sale values." Her voice broke slightly. "Some had been in that cellar for months, being prepared for their new lives." Jackson's jaw tightened as anger stirred in his chest, a familiar dangerous heat he hadn't felt in years. And Judge Sullivan's involvement? Legal documents needed his approval. Adoption papers, indenture contracts, travel permissions for minors crossing state lines. Abigail's face showed dawning realization. "That's why they brought me here to New Mexico territory, the judge's jurisdiction." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more sinister than either had initially imagined. Not just trafficking, but an organized operation with connections spanning from Chicago's elite to territorial officials. "What else do you remember about Garrett?" Jackson asked, recalling the name from Abigail's cryptic note. Abigail's brow furrowed. Dark hair, cold eyes. Kingston's right-hand man, though he presented himself as a business associate. She shuddered visibly. "He was the one who caught me trying to help 2 of the children escape. After that pain darkness, I think they drugged me during the journey here." Jackson processed this information mentally, constructing a timeline of events. "And the men in the forest, the ones who died." "Fragments only," Abigail admitted. I think they were arguing about what to do with me. One wanted to return me to Garrett. Another suggested ending it quickly." Her hand unconsciously rose to her throat. "I remember a knife shouting gunshots. Then running, though I don't know how I got away." She looked up at Jackson, frustration evident. "Why can't I remember it all? Why these gaps?" "The mind protects itself," Jackson said gently. "Sometimes memory returns in pieces, sometimes never. He'd seen it before among soldiers after particularly brutal battles, the mind walling off horrors too great to bear. Abigail nodded, accepting this explanation even as determination hardened her features. What I do remember is enough. These men, Kingston, Sullivan, Garrett, they're selling children Jackson, using and discarding them like commodities, and no one's stopping them because no one knows. Except you, Jackson pointed out, which makes you dangerous to them. And now you, too, Abigail added softly. I've brought this down on you. Jackson shook his head. I made my choice when I found you. No regrets. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to examine too closely. After a moment, Jackson rose and checked his Winchester, a habit born of years living by the gun. We should move camp tomorrow. Stay mobile. Eventually, we'll need to contact Pastor Bennett again. Get word to authorities outside Sullivan's influence. The territorial governor, Abigail suggested. Perhaps. Or federal marshals. Jackson's expression turned grim. But first we need proof beyond your testimony. Your word against a respected judge and a wealthy Chicago businessman won't be enough. Abigail's shoulders slumped slightly as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. Even if they survived long enough to bring the accusations, would anyone believe them? Would justice prevail against men of such standing and influence? As if reading her thoughts, Jackson added quietly, "One step at a time, Abigail. First safety, then justice." The day passed in watchful vigilance with Jackson, teaching Abigail more survival skills, how to move silently through forest undergrowth, how to identify edible plants, how to read weather patterns and cloud formations. The practical lessons seemed to ground her, providing focus beyond the horrors of her memories and the uncertainty of their future. That evening, as they sat beside a small, carefully banked fire, Abigail asked the question that had been forming since their flight began. Who were you, Jackson, before you became a bounty hunter, before the war? Who were you then? The unexpected inquiry caught Jackson off guard. Few people had ever asked about his origins, most being more interested in, or intimidated by, his deadly reputation. For a moment, he considered deflection, as had become his habit over decades of guarded solitude. Yet something in Abigail's direct gaze invited honesty. "A farmer's son from Tennessee," he said finally. "Youngest of 3 brothers, all gone now. Father taught me tracking hunting. Mother taught me reading and basic figures from the family Bible." A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. "Had a talent for understanding land, for moving through it unseen. Made me useful when the war came. And after the war, why not return to farming?" Jackson's expression darkened. "Nothing to return to. Farm, burned family dead or scattered. And I'd seen too much, done too much. Didn't fit anymore in peaceful places." He stared into the flames, their dancing light reflecting in his eyes. The gun had become comfortable. Too comfortable. Abigail absorbed this with quiet understanding. Until Rebecca, Jackson agreed. She saw past the killer to the man beneath. Made me want to be worthy of that vision. His voice grew softer. For a time, I almost was. The confession hung in the air between them, unexpectedly intimate. Abigail reached across the space separating them, her hand coming to rest lightly on Jackson's weathered one. "I think you still are," she said simply. Before Jackson could respond, both froze at a sound that didn't belong in the wilderness, the distant but unmistakable crack of a breaking branch. Jackson extinguished the fire with a swift movement, plunging them into darkness broken only by starlight. His hand found the Winchester Abigail's, the Colt, both moving with practiced silence to defensive positions. Minutes stretched into an eternity of heightened senses, straining to hear beyond the natural sounds of the forest, searching the darkness for movement that didn't belong. When a low voice spoke from the shadows near the canyon entrance, Jackson's rifle was already aimed in that direction. "Easy now," the voice cautioned. "I'm coming in slow. No need for shooting." "Show yourself," Jackson commanded, his finger tense on the trigger. A figure emerged into the moonlight, hands held carefully away from his body. He was a tall man, perhaps 50, with a grizzled beard and the lean, weathered look of someone who lived by wilderness rules. A rifle was slung across his back, but he made no move to reach for it. "Name's Liam Blackwood," he said, eyes fixed on Jackson's Winchester. "Heard you might be in these parts." "Who told you that?" Jackson demanded, rifle unwavering. "Bennett, Pastor sent me. Said you might need help." Jackson's aim didn't falter. "Pastor Bennett would never send someone I don't know." A faint smile crossed the stranger's face. "He said you'd say that." He slowly reached into his shirt pocket, movements deliberate and non-threatening. "He gave me this to show you." He extended his hand, a small object glinting in the moonlight. Jackson nodded to Abigail, who approached cautiously, took the item, and returned to Jackson's side. It was a cavalry medal tarnished with age. Jackson recognized it immediately. Bennett's commendation for valor, something the pastor kept, but never displayed. Jackson lowered his rifle slightly. "Bennett wouldn't part with this willingly." "He didn't," Blackwood confirmed. "Just loaned it. Said to tell you Shiloh, second day. Said you'd understand." The tension in Jackson's shoulders eased fractionally. It was a reference only he and Bennett would know, to the battle where they'd first met Jackson, as a Union scout, Bennett as a cavalry sergeant. "You're welcome to share our fire," Jackson said finally, though caution remained in his posture. "Once we relight it." Blackwood nodded, moving slowly to a spot across from them, while Jackson rekindled the small flame. In the renewed firelight, Abigail studied their visitor warily. "The pastor didn't say you had company." Blackwood observed, his gaze lingering on Abigail with undisguised curiosity. "The pastor didn't know everything," Jackson replied evenly. "Why did he send you?" Blackwood leaned back against a boulder, his posture relaxed, though his eyes remained alert. "Town's buzzing with news of a missing woman and a reward. Judge Sullivan's deputized extra men sent them scouring the territory. Your place was searched 2 days after you left." "And you're here because—" Jackson pressed. "Bennett thought you could use someone who knows these mountains, someone not connected to you." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "And someone with personal reasons to work against Sullivan." "What reasons?" Abigail asked, speaking for the first time. Blackwood studied her for a long moment before answering. "My son, Thomas, disappeared 5 years back. 17 years old. Was supposed to be working a job in Denver." Pain flashed across his weathered face. "Never heard from him again. Letters came back unclaimed." "You believe he was taken?" Jackson asked quietly. "Didn't at first. Thought maybe he'd just run off, found adventure somewhere." Blackwood's voice grew bitter. "Then I started hearing stories. Other young men, women too, disappearing from these parts, all with proper paperwork, all approved by the judge." "You think Sullivan was involved in your son's disappearance?" Abigail stated. Blackwood nodded grimly. "Know it now. Found his name in old court records. Approved for apprenticeship transfer to Colorado Territory. Signature of legal guardian, mine, except I never signed a damn thing." Jackson and Abigail exchanged a glance, the implications clear. Sullivan's involvement in trafficking wasn't new, and it wasn't limited to the Kingston connection. I'm sorry about your son, Abigail said softly. Blackwood acknowledged her sympathy with a curt nod. Been tracking Sullivan's operations for years. Nothing solid enough to bring him down. Then Bennett told me what you discovered in Chicago. His eyes fixed on Abigail with newfound intensity. Said you have proof. Memories, Abigail corrected, fragmented ones, and they're still coming back. Better than nothing, Blackwood replied. More than I've had. Jackson, who had been silent watching their exchange, finally spoke. We'll work together, for now, but I call the shots when it comes to our safety. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Figured the famous Jackson Reeves would say something like that. Jackson's expression remained impassive, though Abigail noticed his hand tighten slightly on the rifle. That name doesn't exist anymore. If you say so, Blackwood replied with a shrug. Though Sullivan's men are looking for both Jackson Cole and Reeves, seems they've done their homework. The reminder that their pursuers knew Jackson's true identity hung in the air, an uncomfortable confirmation of how thoroughly they'd been investigated. Get some rest, Jackson said finally. I'll take first watch. As Blackwood rolled out his bedding on the far side of the fire, Abigail moved closer to Jackson, lowering her voice. Can we trust him? Jackson's eyes remained on their new companion. Bennett trusted him enough to send him. That counts for something. But not everything. A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. Not everything. Later, as Abigail lay beneath her blanket sleep, eluding her, she found her thoughts drifting to the girl with red hair, who had begun appearing in her dreams. The child seemed familiar in a way Abigail couldn't articulate. Not one of the Kingston's captives, but someone connected to her personally. The dreams always ended the same way, the girl calling Abigail's name, reaching out with desperate hands, before vanishing into darkness. Abigail closed her eyes, trying to capture the child's features, to place her in some context that made sense. There was something there, something important, hovering just beyond the reach of conscious memory. Morning brought clearer skies and a tacit acceptance of Blackwood's presence in their small group. The hunter proved himself useful, showing them a hidden trail that led deeper into the mountains, while avoiding the main passes where Sullivan's men might be watching. Used to hunt these ridges with my boy, Blackwood explained, as they rode single file along a narrow ledge. Know every game trail and hideout for 50 miles. Jackson, taking the lead, nodded in acknowledgement. How far to your cabin? Day and a half if we push. Place isn't much, but it's secure. Built it after I left town, few people know about it. And those who do, Abigail asked from her position between the two men. Blackwood's expression darkened. Won't be talking to Sullivan or anyone else. The certainty in his tone prompted no further questions. They made camp that night in a natural hollow formed by massive boulders, offering shelter and concealment. As they ate a sparse meal of jerky and beans, Blackwood turned to Jackson. Bennett says you knew Sullivan during the war. Jackson paused, then nodded once. Different man then, or seemed to be. How so? Abigail asked. Jackson's expression grew distant, recalling memories long undisturbed. He was a captain in the Union Army. Respected. Fair to his men, tough on deserters, but not cruel. Had a reputation for honesty. Wouldn't tolerate looting or mistreatment of civilians, even Confederate ones. Hard to reconcile with the man he became, Blackwood observed. People change, Jackson replied, his tone flat. War does things to a man's soul, and what comes after can do worse. What happened to him? Abigail pressed gently. Jackson shrugged. Lost track after Appomattox. Next I heard he'd studied law, become a territorial judge. Seemed to be doing well for himself. Too well, Blackwood interjected bitterly. Man lives like a king in redemption. Has the finest house, finest clothes, finest everything, and everyone bows and scrapes like he's royalty. Power corrupts, Abigail murmured. Or reveals, Jackson countered. Sometimes what looks like change is just the mask slipping. They fell silent, each contemplating how a respected officer could transform or reveal himself as a trafficker in human misery. He lost his family, Blackwood said suddenly. Few years back, cholera took his wife and boy. Some say that changed him. Jackson's expression remained unreadable, though Abigail thought she detected a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or unwanted empathy, in his eyes. Grief doesn't justify selling children, he said finally. No, Blackwood agreed. It doesn't. The night deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath their light. Abigail, taking her turn at watch while the others slept, found herself contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought her here, from the sheltered halls of academia to a Chicago mansion, to this wild place in the company of damaged men seeking their own forms of justice or redemption. When sleep finally claimed her, the red-haired girl returned to her dreams more vivid than before. This time Abigail could hear her voice clearly, calling a name that sent a shock of recognition through her slumbering mind. Abby, Abby, don't leave me. Abigail woke with a gasp, the first light of dawn barely touching the eastern sky. Beside her, Jackson was already alert, watching her with concern. Bad dream, he asked quietly. Abigail shook her head, her heart racing. Not bad, just strange. There's a girl in my dreams calling for me. She seems so familiar, but I can't place her. Jackson handed her a cup of coffee, its warmth welcome in the morning chill. Another memory trying to surface, maybe. Maybe, Abigail agreed, though uncertainty lingered in her voice. It feels different, though, more personal than the Kingston children. They broke camp shortly after continuing their journey toward Blackwood's cabin. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses over the most treacherous sections. By midday, they had descended into a dense pine forest, the air heavy with the scent of resin and damp earth. It was there, as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, that Abigail experienced another memory breakthrough. She had knelt to fill their canteens when a flash of red caught her eye. A cardinal landing momentarily on a nearby branch before taking flight again. The vivid color against the green foliage triggered something deep in her mind. Abigail froze the canteen slipping from her suddenly numb fingers. Sophie, she whispered the name emerging unbidden. Jackson, who had been checking his mare's hoof, looked up sharply. What is it? Abigail didn't answer immediately, her mind flooded with images. A little girl with flaming red hair identical to her own in every way except the color laughing as they ran through a garden. 2 beds in a shared room, dolls arranged in careful rows. A hand clutching hers as they walked to school. Sophie, she repeated stronger now. My sister, my twin. Jackson approached slowly, concern evident in his expression. You remember her now? Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as the memories crystallized. We were 5, playing in the yard at our home in Boston. A man came to the gate, asked for directions. Her voice faltered. I went inside to get Papa. When I came back, Sophie was gone. She looked up at Jackson, anguish etched on her features. How could I have forgotten my own sister? Trauma, Jackson said gently. The mind buries what it can't bear. My parents searched for years, Abigail continued, the memories flowing now. It destroyed them. Papa turned to drink Mama to laudanum. Eventually, we moved to Chicago for Papa's teaching position, but they were never the same. Blackwood, who had been watching silently, spoke up. This sister, the girl from your dreams. Abigail nodded slowly. I think so, but why now? Why am I dreaming of her after all these years? A terrible suspicion began forming in her mind, too awful to articulate. Jackson, seeing the horror dawning in her eyes, knelt beside her. What is it? The children, Abigail whispered. Kingston's ledger. What if Sophie was taken by the same people? What if she's been in this system all these years? The possibility hung in the air, simultaneously devastating and hope-giving. If Sophie had been taken by the same trafficking network, it meant there was a chance, however slim, that she might still be alive. But it also meant she had endured unimaginable suffering. We need to see that ledger, Jackson said decisively. If your sister's name is there, it would be proof of a long-standing operation. And might tell us where she is now, Blackwood added. Abigail rose to her feet, a new determination hardening her features. Then we need to get to redemption. Garrett will have records correspondence. If anyone knows what happened to Sophie, it would be him. Jackson studied her for a long moment, weighing her renewed strength against the danger such a course would entail. It's a risk, he said finally. Sullivan's men will be watching for us. Some risks are worth taking, Abigail replied, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her eyes. Jackson glanced at Blackwood, who gave a slight nod of agreement. All right, Jackson decided, but we do this carefully. No rushing in. We'll need help in town. Rose Chen, Blackwood suggested, runs the apothecary. No love for Sullivan or his cronies. Can she be trusted? Jackson asked. A hint of a smile crossed Blackwood's weathered face. More than most, has her own reasons for hating the judge, and she's smart connected. Hears things others don't. Then Rose Chen it is, Jackson agreed. But first we rest at your cabin plan properly. One wrong move in redemption could get us all killed. They continued their journey, the atmosphere between them subtly changed by Abigail's revelation. The abstract quest for justice had become deeply personal, the theoretical victims now connected by blood to their small party. As they rode, Abigail found herself searching her newly recovered memories for clues about Sophie, anything that might help them find her after all these years. The red hair so distinctive, surely someone would remember that. And if Sophie had been sold through Kingston's network, there would be records documentation. For the first time since her escape, Abigail felt something beyond fear and confusion. A fragile hope was taking root, tempered by the knowledge of what her sister might have endured, but hope nonetheless. And with it came resolve, not just to expose Sullivan and Kingston, but to find Sophie to make whole what had been brutally torn apart 23 years ago. Blackwood's cabin proved to be more substantial than his modest description had suggested. Built of solid logs and nestled against a cliff face that shielded it from the worst of the mountain weather, it offered both security and basic comforts. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, animal hides covered the packed earth floor, and sturdy furniture, crafted by hand, demonstrated Blackwood's skill with tools. "Built it myself," he explained as they settled in. "After Thomas disappeared. Couldn't stand town anymore, all those sympathetic looks turning to whispers behind my back. Poor Blackwood gone mad with grief, seeing conspiracies everywhere." His bitter tone revealed wounds still raw, despite the passage of years. "They'll believe you now," Abigail said quietly. "When we expose Sullivan." Blackwood's expression remained skeptical. People believe what's comfortable, Miss Hayes, and it's mighty uncomfortable to think your respected judge is selling children. Jackson, who had been checking the cabin's sightlines through the small windows, rejoined them. That's why we need proof, undeniable evidence. And a plan for after, Abigail added. Sullivan won't go down without a fight. Even with evidence, he controls the law in redemption. Which is why we take the evidence to Santa Fe, Jackson said, to the territorial governor, outside Sullivan's jurisdiction. Long ride, Blackwood observed. Through country Sullivan knows well. Jackson nodded grimly. One problem at a time. First, we need the evidence. They spent the remainder of the day recovering from their journey and planning their approach to redemption. Blackwood's knowledge of the town and its surroundings proved invaluable, as did his understanding of Sullivan's routines and associates. Judge holds court 3 days a week, he explained, sketching a rough map of the town. Spends evenings at his home on the hill overlooking town. Very regular in his habits. Believes it shows his stability and reliability. And Garrett, Abigail asked. Kingston's man. Stays at the Frontier Hotel when in town. Best accommodations in Redemption. Has a corner room on the 2nd floor overlooking the main street. You've been watching him, Jackson observed. Blackwood's expression hardened. For years. Him and everyone connected to Sullivan. Just never had proof, only suspicions. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, the plan taking shape. Abigail would enter town disguised as a widow, her distinctive red hair hidden beneath a bonnet. She would contact Rose Chen at the apothecary, while Jackson and Blackwood maintained positions outside town, ready to intervene if necessary. I should be the one to go in, Jackson argued. It's too dangerous for you. Abigail shook her head firmly. I know what to look for in Garrett's papers, and I'm less likely to be recognized than you. Sullivan's men have your description. She's right, Blackwood reluctantly agreed. A woman alone draws less attention, especially a widow in mourning. Jackson remained unconvinced but recognized the logic in their arguments. You'll need a weapon, and you don't approach Garrett directly under any circumstances. Of course not, Abigail assured him. I'll speak only with Rose Chen. If she can help us access Garrett's room while he's meeting with Sullivan, all the better. And if things go wrong, Jackson pressed. I'll find a way out, Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. You've taught me well. Later, as Blackwood took first watch and Jackson prepared for sleep, Abigail found herself studying the map of Redemption again, committing its layout to memory. The town was small, centered around a main street, with the courthouse at one end and the church at the other. Civilization's bookends in the wilderness. Nervous? Jackson asked quietly, noting her intense focus. Terrified, Abigail admitted with a small smile. But also determined. For Sophie. For all of them. Jackson nodded understanding in his eyes. Fear and determination aren't mutually exclusive. Best fighters I knew were always scared. Kept them sharp. Were you scared, when you were hunting men? Jackson considered the question, his expression thoughtful. At first. Later. No. And that's when I should have stopped. When the fear leaves entirely, something else has gone with it. Your humanity? Abigail suggested softly. Part of it, at least. Jackson's gaze met hers directly. Don't lose your fear, Abigail. Just don't let it master you. The quiet intensity of his words stayed with her as she finally drifted to sleep. Sophie's face mingling with Jackson's in her dreams, both calling her toward some undefined resolution. Morning brought preparations for their journey to redemption. Blackwood provided Abigail with suitable clothing for her widow disguise, items left behind by a woman he declined to name, though the pain in his eyes suggested a story there. Jackson cleaned and checked weapons, ensuring both Abigail's Colt and his own firearms were in perfect working order. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. The plan called for them to approach Redemption separately. Abigail from the main road as a traveler, Jackson and Blackwood by less visible routes that would allow them to maintain observation positions without entering town themselves. Rose Chen's apothecary is on Willow Street, just off the main thoroughfare, Blackwood reminded Abigail. Small place, green door, can't miss the Chinese characters on the sign. And if she refuses to help? Abigail asked. Tell her Liam sent you, mentioned Thomas. A shadow crossed Blackwood's face. She'll understand. As they prepared to separate, Jackson took Abigail aside. Be careful, he said, his usual stoicism softened by evident concern. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, abandon the plan and get out. We'll find another way. Abigail nodded, touched by his worry. I will. I promise. Impulsively, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a brief contact that nevertheless sent warmth spreading through her. For luck, she explained, stepping back quickly. Jackson looked momentarily startled, then gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. Ride safe. They parted ways at the base of the mountain trail, Abigail turning her horse toward the main road, while Jackson and Blackwood veered east toward the ridgeline that would give them a clear view of Redemption without exposing their position. Alone for the first time since her escape, Abigail felt vulnerability creeping back, the confidence she'd displayed for Jackson's benefit wavering. Yet beneath the fear lay a foundation of newfound strength, skills, learned hardships, endured, a purpose discovered. She straightened her spine, adjusted the bonnet that concealed her distinctive hair, and urged her horse forward. Whether she was ready or not, the time for action had come. Redemption appeared on the horizon by early afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets nestled in a valley. From a distance, it looked peaceful, even picturesque. The white steeple of the church reaching skyward, the sturdy courthouse standing proud at the town's center. Abigail approached at a measured pace, the very picture of a respectable widow traveling alone. She had practiced the role during their journey. The slight stoop of shoulders suggesting grief's burden, the downcast eyes, the self-contained demeanor that discouraged casual conversation. As she rode down the main street, Abigail was conscious of eyes upon her. Curious glances from shopkeepers evaluating looks from women, more predatory assessments from men lounging outside the saloon. She kept her gaze forward, playing her part while registering every detail. The Frontier Hotel stood prominent on the right side of the street, a two-story structure with pretensions to elegance. Through the large front windows, Abigail glimpsed a well-dressed man she instantly recognized as Garrett, deep in conversation with another gentleman. Her heart raced at the sight of him, memories of fear and pain threatening to surface, but she maintained her composure and continued past. Willow Street proved to be a narrow lane branching off the main thoroughfare, lined with smaller businesses catering to the town's daily needs rather than its vices. The apothecary was exactly as Blackwood had described, a modest storefront with a green door and a sign bearing both English and Chinese characters. Abigail tethered her horse at the hitching post and took a steadying breath before entering. A small bell announced her arrival, its cheerful tone at odds with her trepidation. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight smelling of herbs and medicinal compounds. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles, jars, and packages labeled in neat handwriting. Behind a polished wooden counter stood a woman Abigail judged to be in her late 50s, her straight black hair streaked with silver, her features showing her Chinese heritage, though softened by what appeared to be European ancestry as well. "Good afternoon," the woman greeted her English perfect, though carrying a slight accent. "How may I help you?" Abigail glanced around to ensure they were alone before responding in a lowered voice. "Are you Rose Chen?" The woman's expression grew cautious, though her polite smile remained fixed. "I am. And you are—" "My name is Abigail Hayes. Liam Blackwood sent me." At the mention of Blackwood's name, Rose's demeanor changed subtly, not more welcoming but more alert, assessing Abigail with newfound intensity. "Liam Blackwood doesn't send many people my way," she said carefully. "What does he want?" "He mentioned I should speak of Thomas," Abigail replied, recalling Blackwood's instruction. Something flashed in Rose's eyes, pain, anger recognition, before she moved swiftly to the front window, glancing out before pulling down the shade. With efficient movements, she locked the door and turned the sign to "Closed." "Come to the back," she instructed, leading Abigail through a curtained doorway to a small living area. "It's safer to talk there." The rear of the shop contained a modest living space, a stove, a table with chairs, shelves lined with books and personal items that reflected both Chinese and Western influences. Rose gestured for Abigail to sit, then poured 2 cups of tea from a pot, keeping warm on the stove. "Now," she said, placing a cup before Abigail, "tell me everything." Abigail did, recounting her discovery of the children at the Kingston house, her capture, her rescue by Jackson, and their subsequent flight. She explained their plan to find evidence of Sullivan's corruption and the ambush that had separated them. Throughout the narrative, Rose listened attentively, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. When Abigail finished, Rose remained silent for a long moment, absently turning her teacup in its saucer. Finally, she spoke. "Judge Sullivan is indeed powerful in this territory. Respected, feared, his word is law in redemption." Her eyes met Abigail's directly. Accusing such a man without irrefutable evidence would be suicide. "I know," Abigail acknowledged. "That's why we need to find documentation." Liam thought Garrett Kingston's man might have brought papers with him. Rose nodded slowly. "A man named Garrett checked into the hotel 3 days ago. Expensive clothes, Eastern accent, moves like someone dangerous." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "He's been meeting with the judge daily and hiring men. Rough sorts from the saloon." Hope surged in Abigail's chest. "That's him. Do you know where he's staying, which room?" "Second floor of the Frontier Hotel, corner room overlooking the street." Rose's expression turned grave. "But he's not alone. Has 2 men with him and more coming and going with reports." "The search parties," Abigail realized aloud. "They're coordinating from town." "Yes," Rose confirmed. "And I believe I know why you interest them so much." She rose and moved to a drawer, extracting a folded newspaper. "This arrived yesterday from Chicago." She handed the paper to Abigail, who unfolded it to find a prominent story about her disappearance, complete with a reward notice doubled from the previous amount. But it was the accompanying article that caught her attention. A quote from Harrison Kingston expressing concern that his children's governess might have become confused and dangerous due to troubling delusions she had begun exhibiting before her disappearance. "He's discrediting me," Abigail said softly, "laying groundwork to dismiss anything I might say." "A common tactic," Rose agreed, "especially against women who pose a threat." Abigail set the paper aside, her resolve hardening rather than weakening at this evidence of Kingston's machinations. "All the more reason we need solid proof. Garrett must have papers correspondence, something that can't be dismissed as the ravings of a delusional woman." Rose studied her thoughtfully. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone broken, frightened." Instead, I find a woman determined to fight back regardless of the cost. A hint of approval touched Rose's features. I will help you, but not because Liam asked. I'll help because your cause is just. Relief washed through Abigail. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Rose cautioned. What you propose is dangerous. If caught, neither of us would see morning. I understand the risk. Rose's expression softened slightly. I believe you do. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, though they were alone. There's something else you should know. About Jackson Reeves. Abigail tensed. What about him? His wife Rebecca. She was my cousin. The revelation stunned Abigail into momentary silence. Your cousin? But he never mentioned. He doesn't know, Rose interrupted. I was estranged from that branch of the family when I married Chen. They considered it inappropriate. A flicker of old pain crossed her features. I only learned of Rebecca's death years later, by which time Jackson had disappeared into his grief and rage. Why tell me this now? Abigail asked, struggling to process this unexpected connection. Rose's gaze was steady, evaluating. Because you care for him. I see it in your eyes when you speak his name, and he deserves someone who understands what he's lost, what he's fighting to reclaim. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed that her feelings were so transparent. We barely know each other. A small smile touched Rose's lips. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind has yet to comprehend. She grew serious again. But more importantly, you should know that Rebecca wasn't simply murdered in a random robbery as Jackson believes. What do you mean? Rebecca was helping women escape abusive situations, creating new identities, finding safe placements. Some of those women had children. Rose's voice dropped lower. I believe she discovered the same network you did years earlier, and it cost her her life. The implications of this revelation struck Abigail like a physical blow. If true, it meant Jackson's personal tragedy was directly connected to the very trafficking operation they were now fighting. That Rebecca had died for the same cause that now drove their mission. Does Liam know this? She asked. Rose shook her head. Only suspicions, nothing concrete. I've pieced it together over years, watching Sullivan, noting patterns. Jackson needs to know, Abigail insisted. This changes everything. Perhaps, Rose conceded. But first, let's focus on obtaining the evidence you seek. Knowledge without proof is merely suspicion, and suspicion won't bring down Sullivan or Kingston. She rose, moving to a small desk where she withdrew paper and ink. Let me draw you a map of the hotel's interior. There's a service entrance the maids use, less visible than the main doors. As Rose sketched, Abigail found her mind racing with the implications of what she'd learned. Not only was Sophie possibly caught in the same trafficking network, but Rebecca's death might be directly tied to it as well. The connections were almost too painful to contemplate. So many lives destroyed by the same corrupt system spanning decades and territories. There, Rose said, pushing the completed map across the table. Garrett typically meets with Sullivan at the courthouse around 4 o'clock. The meeting usually lasts an hour. That would be your best opportunity. Abigail studied the drawing, committing it to memory. What about his men? They rotate shifts. One remains at the hotel, while the other accompanies Garrett. The second-floor corridor will be watched. So I'll need a distraction, Abigail concluded. Rose nodded. I can provide one. A medical emergency at the saloon across the street. Something dramatic enough to draw attention, including that of Garrett's guard. When? Tomorrow, Rose decided. 4:15 precisely. I'll ensure every eye is turned toward the commotion. You'll have perhaps 10 minutes before someone thinks to check Garrett's room. 10 minutes, Abigail repeated. It will have to be enough. They spent the next hour refining the plan, accounting for contingencies and escape routes. Rose provided Abigail with servant's clothing for disguise and offered a room above the apothecary for the night. "What about Jackson and Liam?" Abigail asked. "They'll be expecting me to return." "I'll send word," Rose assured her. "My nephew Nathan can deliver a message to their position without being seen." As dusk settled over Redemption, Abigail found herself standing at the small window of Rose's spare room, watching the lamplights of the town flicker to life. Somewhere beyond the surrounding hills, Jackson and Blackwood were waiting, perhaps watching these same lights, concerned for her safety. And somewhere, perhaps much closer than she realized, Sophie might be waiting too, not knowing her twin sister was finally searching for her after all these years. Abigail touched the glass cool beneath her fingertips and made a silent promise to both her sister and Jackson. She would find the evidence they needed. She would expose Sullivan and Kingston. And she would not rest until both justice and reunion were achieved, no matter the cost. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a deceptive serenity belying the danger that lay ahead. Abigail woke early, having slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragments of memory. Sophie's laughter, Kingston's rage, Jackson's steady presence. Rose was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of tea and rice porridge. Her nephew Nathan had returned late the previous night after successfully delivering a message to Jackson and Blackwood, confirming that they understood the plan and would remain in position outside town. "Nathan says your friends were not pleased with the arrangement," Rose remarked as they ate, "particularly Mr. Reeves. He wanted to come into town himself." "That sounds like Jackson," Abigail agreed with a small smile. "He's protective." "With good reason," Rose replied. "Garrett's men have been asking questions around town showing your photograph from the Chicago paper. They're offering a substantial reward for information." The news sent a chill through Abigail. "All the more reason to move quickly. Get the evidence and leave Redemption before they realize I'm here." "Yes," Rose agreed. "Though leaving may prove more difficult than entering, Sullivan has men watching the roads." "We'll find a way," Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. "Jackson knows these mountains better than Sullivan's hired guns." They spent the morning reviewing the plan and preparing Abigail's disguise. The servant's dress Rose provided was plain but clean, the fabric sturdy and unremarkable. A cap would cover Abigail's distinctive hair, and Rose showed her how to stoop slightly and adopt the hurried, efficient movements of a woman with tasks to complete and no time to waste. "Servants are invisible," Rose explained. "People look past them, not at them. Use that to your advantage." Abigail practiced her role, moving through the small apartment with increasing confidence. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the educated governess with her proper speech and erect posture, replaced by a woman whose entire demeanor suggested a life of hard work and limited expectations. As midday approached, Rose provided final instructions. "The service door will be unlocked. I've arranged it through one of the kitchen girls who owes me a favor. Once inside, take the back stairs to the second floor. Garrett's room is at the end of the corridor facing the street." And the distraction. "Nathan will start it precisely at 4:15. You'll hear the commotion. It will be impossible to miss." Rose pressed a small brass key into Abigail's palm. "This opens most of the guest room doors. The hotel's owner is too cheap to have different locks for each room." Abigail pocketed the key. "And if it doesn't work?" Rose handed her a slender metal tool. "Then use this. My late husband had many skills before he became a doctor. He taught me a few that proper society might frown upon." Despite her nerves, Abigail couldn't help smiling at the unexpected revelation. "You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Chen." "Rose, please. and survival often requires skills beyond those taught in finishing schools. She gave Abigail a critical once-over. Ready? Abigail took a deep breath, mentally reviewing each step of the plan. Ready. They parted at the back door of the apothecary. Rose to prepare her medical supplies for the staged emergency, Abigail to make her way discreetly to the hotel. The servant's dress and cap provided excellent camouflage as she moved through Redemption's back alleys, head down pace, brisk, but not hurried. The Frontier Hotel's service entrance was exactly where Rose had indicated, a plain door at the rear of the building partially concealed by stacked crates. Abigail approached with a natural air of belonging, as if returning from an errand. When she tried the handle, it turned easily, just as promised. The kitchen beyond was busy with afternoon preparations, staff moving efficiently between tasks. Abigail slipped through, nodding vaguely to a harried-looking cook, who barely glanced her way. Rose had been right. In these clothes, with the right demeanor, she was practically invisible. The back stairs were narrow and steep, used by staff to access upper floors without disturbing guests in the main lobby. Abigail climbed quickly, encountering no one. At the second-floor landing, she paused, listening carefully before opening the door to the corridor. The hallway was empty, though she could hear voices from some of the rooms, a woman laughing, a man's deep tones discussing business, the cry of a child quickly hushed. At the far end, where the corridor turned toward the front of the building, a chair had been positioned outside what must be Garrett's room. Currently unoccupied, the guard presumably accompanying his employer to the courthouse meeting. Abigail moved forward with purpose, carrying a folded stack of towels she'd taken from a linen closet to justify her presence if questioned. Each step brought her closer to her goal, each moment stretching with tension as she anticipated discovery. Just as she reached the corner, footsteps sounded from the main staircase. Abigail froze, then quickly busied herself with straightening a wall sconce, keeping her face averted, as a man rounded the corner. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to violence. One of Garrett's men, without doubt. He gave Abigail only the briefest glance before settling into the chair outside the corner room, his posture alert, despite his seemingly relaxed position. Abigail's heart sank. The guard had returned earlier than expected. Perhaps Garrett's meeting with Sullivan had been rescheduled or shortened. Either way, her carefully planned timing was now disrupted. She continued down the hallway, mind racing, as she sought a new approach. The distraction wouldn't begin for another 20 minutes. Until then, she needed to remain inconspicuous while staying close enough to act when the opportunity arose. Fate intervened in the form of a bell ringing insistently from one of the rooms midway down the corridor. The guard looked up, annoyed at the disruption to his vigilance. After a moment of hesitation, he rose. "You," he called to Abigail. "See what they want in room 4. I need to stay here." Abigail nodded meekly, turning toward the indicated room. It was the perfect cover, allowing her to remain in the corridor legitimately while awaiting the distraction. The occupant of room 4 proved to be an elderly gentleman demanding fresh water and complaining about the noise from adjacent rooms. Abigail played her role perfectly deferential and efficient, promising to return promptly with his water. As she emerged back into the corridor, a commotion erupted from the street below. Shouts, a woman screamed, the sound of breaking glass. The guard tensed, moving to the window at the end of the hall that overlooked the main street. Abigail approached, carrying the water pitcher she'd collected for the elderly guest. "What's happening, sir?" she asked, the perfect picture of concerned servitude. The guard peered through the window. "Some kind of fight at the saloon. Looks bad. Someone's down." Rose's distraction had begun right on schedule, and it was indeed impossible to miss. The street below had erupted into chaos, with people gathering around what appeared to be an injured man outside the saloon. Nathan was playing his part well, thrashing dramatically while Rose administered emergency treatment. "Shouldn't you help?" Abigail suggested innocently, "being with the law and all." The guard hesitated clearly, torn between his duty to guard Garrett's room and the natural curiosity about the scene unfolding below. The decision was made for him when someone in the crowd shouted, "Murder!" and the commotion intensified. "Stay here," he ordered Abigail. "Don't let anyone near that corner room. I'll be right back." With that, he hurried toward the stairs, hand on his pistol. Abigail waited until his footsteps faded before setting down the water pitcher and moving swiftly to Garrett's door. The brass key slid into the lock, smoothly turning with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the empty corridor. Abigail pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, then closed it quietly behind her. Garrett's room was larger than she'd expected, befitting his status as Kingston's representative. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, a writing desk positioned beneath the window overlooking the street. Precisely arranged clothing hung in an open wardrobe, and a leather satchel sat on a chair in the corner. Abigail moved quickly to the desk, conscious of every passing second. Papers were stacked neatly, some bearing official letterheads, others written in a flowing hand she recognized as Garrett's. She scanned them rapidly, searching for anything that might implicate Sullivan or Kingston. A ledger caught her attention, bound in red leather similar to the one she'd glimpsed in Kingston's study. She opened it with trembling fingers, finding page after page of entries, names, dates, amounts paid and received. Some entries were coded, but others were devastatingly clear. Children listed by age and skills, prices negotiated, destinations specified. "My God," Abigail whispered, horrified by the scope of the operation revealed in these meticulous records. This wasn't just a few children, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, over years of operation. She turned pages frantically, searching for Sophie's name for any entry dating back to their childhood. The older records were toward the back, organized by year. Abigail's finger ran down columns of names, dates, destinations, and suddenly stopped. There it was, Hayes S. Female 5, red hair, green eyes. Acquired Boston, 5/14/70. Exceptional quality, reserved for special client. Sophie, her sister. Proof positive that Kingston's operation, or its predecessor, had taken her twin all those years ago, and she had been alive at least at the time of this entry. Tears blurred Abigail's vision as the reality of her discovery sank in. Sophie hadn't been killed as her parents had feared in their darkest moments. She had been taken deliberately targeted for her unusual coloring and sold like property. Forcing herself to focus through the emotional storm, Abigail searched for more recent entries. If Sophie had remained in the system, there might be updated information on her whereabouts. A noise in the corridor, footsteps approaching, jolted her back to the present danger. She couldn't take the entire ledger. It was too bulky to conceal. Instead, she quickly tore out the pages containing Sophie's entry and several others showing Sullivan's signature on transfer approvals. As the footsteps drew nearer, Abigail spotted a portfolio on the bedside table. She opened it quickly, finding correspondence between Kingston and Sullivan. Explicit discussions of their arrangement profit splits and strategies for avoiding detection. This was exactly what they needed. Irrefutable evidence of both men's involvement. Abigail stuffed the letters and ledger pages into her bodice, the only hiding place available in her plain servant's dress. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A key rattled in the lock. Abigail looked around desperately for an escape route. The window overlooked a two-story drop to the street below, possible but likely to result in injury. The wardrobe might offer temporary concealment, but would become a trap once discovered. The door began to open. Acting on instinct, Abigail dropped to the floor and rolled beneath the high four-poster bed, pressing herself against the wall, just as the door swung fully open. From her hiding place, she could see only a pair of polished boots entering the room, too fine to belong to the guard. Garrett himself had returned earlier than expected. The boots moved toward the desk, paused, then continued to the bedside table. Abigail held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice the missing correspondence or the disturbed ledger. A muttered curse suggested her prayer would go unanswered. The boots moved quickly back to the desk where papers were shuffled with increasing agitation. "Franklin," Garrett called sharply. "Get in here." Heavier boots joined the first pair, the guard presumably. "Someone's been in here." Garrett's voice was cold with fury. "The portfolio is disturbed and pages are missing from the ledger." "Impossible, sir," the guard protested. "I only left for a minute when that fight broke out. There was just a maid in the hall, and I told her to—" He broke off abruptly, realization dawning. "The maid, red hair under her cap, I think, didn't get a good look at her face." "Find her," Garrett ordered, his tone deadly. "Now, search every room, every closet. She can't have gone far." The guard's boots hurried from the room, while Garrett's remained pacing in evident agitation. He moved to a cabinet, opened it, and extracted what Abigail recognized as a revolver, checking its chambers before returning to the door. "Lock the hotel down," he instructed someone in the corridor. "No one enters or leaves until we find her." The door closed again, leaving Abigail alone in the room. She remained motionless beneath the bed, mind racing. Her escape route was cut off, the hotel being systematically searched. It was only a matter of time before they found her. Rose had warned her that leaving Redemption might prove more difficult than entering. That warning now seemed prophetic. Outside, the commotion in the street was subsiding, the distraction having served its purpose too well. Soon, Garrett's men would realize they had been manipulated, drawing their attention to Rose, and through her, potentially, to Jackson and Blackwood. Everything was unraveling, their carefully constructed plan dissolving into immediate danger. Yet against this mounting peril, Abigail clutched the evidence against her chest, feeling the crinkle of paper that proved her sister had lived, that Sullivan was corrupt, that Kingston was a monster. Whatever happened next, she had what they came for. Now she just needed to survive long enough to use it. Trapped beneath Garrett's bed, Abigail forced herself to breathe slowly, silently, even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. The evidence pressed against her chest felt both precious and damning. Proof of Sullivan's corruption and Sophie's fate, but also the reason men were now hunting her through the hotel. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, doors opening and closing as the search intensified. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to look under the bed. She needed a plan, and quickly. The window remained her best option, despite the dangerous drop. If she could reach the street, she might lose herself in the crowd before Garrett's men could organize a proper pursuit. Abigail inched toward the edge of the bed, freezing when the door opened again. From her limited vantage point, she saw Garrett's polished boots return, accompanied by another pair. Expensive, but worn with distinctive silver spurs. A voice she didn't recognize spoke. "This is most disturbing, Mr. Garrett. Most disturbing indeed." "I apologize for the breach, Judge Sullivan. I've got men searching the hotel. She won't get far." Sullivan. The realization sent a chill down Abigail's spine. The architect of so much suffering was mere feet away, his voice cultured and calm, despite the circumstances. "What exactly was taken?" Sullivan asked. "Pages from the ledger, some correspondence." Garrett's voice held carefully controlled fury. "Enough to cause problems if it reaches the wrong hands." Sullivan's boots moved toward the window, directly in front of Abigail's hiding place. She pressed herself further into the shadows, scarcely daring to breathe. "And you believe it was the Hayes woman? She's here in redemption. The description matches. Red hair visible beneath a servant's cap." Sullivan was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened. "This has become unacceptably messy, Mr. Garrett. Kingston assured me you could handle the situation discreetly." "We underestimated her resourcefulness," Garrett admitted. "And she has help. The Chinese apothecary created a diversion to assist her. They're working together." "Rose Chen." Sullivan spoke the name with disgust. "I've long suspected she harbors anti-establishment sentiments. Search her shop as well." "Already ordered, sir." "Good. And when you find Miss Hayes, and you will find her, bring her to me directly. No witnesses, no complications. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, Judge." The door opened and closed again as Sullivan departed, leaving Garrett alone in the room. He moved to the desk, rummaging through papers and muttering curses. After a moment, he too left, locking the door behind him. Abigail waited several heartbeats, ensuring he was truly gone, before emerging from beneath the bed. Her limbs were stiff from the tense stillness, but adrenaline provided fresh energy as she assessed her situation. The locked door was now a blessing rather than a hindrance, buying her precious minutes before anyone would think to search the room again. She moved swiftly to the window, unlatching it and pushing it open. The street below was busy with townspeople drawn by the earlier commotion, many now watching the hotel with obvious curiosity, as Garrett's men questioned people outside, too exposed. The drop would attract immediate attention, leading to her capture. She needed another way out. Abigail's gaze fell on a decorative ledge running beneath the window extending around the corner of the building. It was narrow, perhaps a foot wide, but might support her weight long enough to reach the adjacent window, which appeared to be a room currently unoccupied in the search. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all she had. Carefully, Abigail climbed onto the windowsill, tucking the stolen documents more securely into her bodice. She took a steadying breath, then extended one leg onto the ledge, testing its strength before committing her full weight. The old wood creaked, but held. Pressing her body flat against the building's exterior, Abigail began inching sideways, focusing solely on the next movement, refusing to look down at the fatal drop, awaiting any misstep. Wind tugged at her clothing, threatening her already precarious balance. Her fingers found minute cracks in the weathered wood, providing minimal but precious purchase, as she edged further from Garrett's window. A shout from below suggested someone had spotted her, but she didn't dare look down to confirm. Instead, she increased her pace, abandoning caution for speed, as she neared the adjacent window. It was closed, but unlatched, yielding to her desperate push. Abigail half fell into the unoccupied room, rolling to absorb the impact, before scrambling to her feet. Footsteps were already pounding in the corridor, her escape route discovered. Thinking quickly, Abigail moved to the door and listened. The footsteps were approaching from the direction of Garrett's room. She opened the door a crack, waiting until the sounds passed, before slipping into the corridor and moving in the opposite direction. The back stairs were her target, the same servant's passage she'd used to enter. She reached them without encountering anyone, the search apparently concentrated on the main staircase and front of the hotel. Descending rapidly, Abigail emerged into the kitchen, which was now in chaos. Staff questioning each other about the search, a harried manager trying to maintain order. She moved through the confusion like a ghost, just another servant caught in the disruption, and slipped out the service door into the alley behind the hotel. Rain had begun to fall, a blessing that drove casual observers indoors and limited visibility. Abigail pulled her cap lower, hunched her shoulders against the weather, and moved away from the hotel at a pace deliberate enough not to attract attention, but quick enough to put distance between herself and her pursuers. Her immediate instinct was to return to Rose's apothecary, but Sullivan's orders made that too dangerous. If they were searching the shop, returning, there would lead to her capture, and potentially endanger Rose as well. Instead, Abigail headed toward the church at the far end of town, reasoning that it might offer temporary sanctuary while she determined her next move. The rain intensified as she walked, soaking her thin dress and plastering her hair to her skull beneath the now sodden cap. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple a pale ghost in the gathering dusk and rain. Abigail approached the side entrance, hoping to slip in unnoticed, but found it locked. As she turned to try the main doors, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling her instinctive cry. "Don't scream!" a familiar voice murmured in her ear. "It's me, Jackson." Relief flooded through her as he released his hand, turning her to face him. His expression was grim, his clothing as soaked as hers, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "You were supposed to wait outside town." "Plans changed when Garrett's men started tearing the place apart, looking for you," he replied tersely. "Rose's nephew found us, said you might need help. Seems he was right." "Where's Rose? Is she safe?" Jackson's expression darkened. "Sullivan's men took her in for questioning. Blackwood's trying to find out where they're holding her." Guilt and fear twisted in Abigail's stomach. "This is my fault. I should never have involved her." "Rose made her choice," Jackson said firmly. "Just like I made mine, just like you made yours." His gaze softened slightly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Abigail nodded, touching her bodice where the documents were concealed. "Evidence against Sullivan and Kingston. And," her voice faltered, "proof that Sophie, my sister, was taken by them 23 years ago." Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, surprise followed by a deeper understanding of what drove her. "Then, it wasn't for nothing," he said quietly. "Now we need to get you out of here." "Not without Rose," Abigail insisted. "I won't leave her to Sullivan's mercy." Jackson looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded reluctantly. "The parsonage," he said, gesturing toward a small building adjacent to the church. "Pastor Bennett arranged it as a safe house if needed. We'll go there, wait for Blackwood's information, then decide our next move." They moved through the rain to the modest dwelling where Bennett himself admitted them with a worried expression. The interior was Spartan, but dry, a small fire burning in the grate, providing welcome warmth. "Thank the Lord you're both safe," Bennett said, helping Abigail remove her sodden outer garments. "The town's in an uproar. Sullivan's men are searching everywhere, making wild claims about stolen documents and conspiracies against the judge." "Not so wild," Jackson replied grimly, positioning himself by the window where he could watch the approach to the parsonage. Abigail found proof of Sullivan's corruption. Bennett's eyebrows rose. "You actually managed it, concrete evidence." Abigail nodded, retrieving the damp but still legible documents from their hiding place. Ledgers showing children being bought and sold. Correspondence between Sullivan and Kingston detailing their arrangement. And, she swallowed hard, records of my sister's abduction 23 years ago. The same network has been operating for decades. Bennett examined the papers with growing horror. "My God," he whispered, "the scale of this, and right under our noses all these years." "Many suspected," Jackson said, his gaze still fixed on the street outside. "But suspicion isn't proof, and Sullivan made sure those who asked too many questions suffered for it." "Like Rose Chen," Abigail added softly. Who's paying for helping me now? Bennett's expression grew troubled. They took her to the courthouse cellars. Sullivan uses them for special questioning outside the regular jail. It's where he deals with those he considers particularly problematic. The implication hung heavy in the small room. Rose was in grave danger, facing not just imprisonment, but torture at Sullivan's hands. We need to get her out, Jackson stated flatly, turning from the window. Tonight, before they can move her, or… He left the alternative unspoken. That's madness, Bennett protested. The courthouse will be guarded especially now. You'd never get in, let alone out with a prisoner. We have to try, Abigail insisted. Rose risked everything to help us. We can't abandon her. Jackson studied her face, recognizing the resolve there. The same determination that had driven her to enter Garrett's room despite the danger. He nodded once, decision made. Pastor, we'll need your help. A distraction, something to draw attention away from the courthouse long enough for us to get in. Bennett looked torn, his duty as a man of God conflicting with his desire for justice. Finally, he sighed heavily. The church bell. If rung at this hour, people will think it's a fire alarm. That should draw most of the town, including guards. Good, Jackson approved. And we'll need weapons. Bennett moved to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal a shotgun and revolver. Left over from my cavalry days, he explained, seeing Abigail's surprise. Never thought I'd have cause to use them again. As the men discussed the approach to the courthouse, Abigail found herself drawn to the fire, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear in her heart. The discovery of Sophie's fate had shaken her more deeply than she'd admitted, even to herself. For 23 years she'd lived with uncertainty, with questions that had no answers. Now, knowing her sister had been taken, deliberately sold, like property raised, who knew how? The reality was almost more painful than the mystery had been. And yet, with the pain came resolution. Sophie had been alive when taken, might still be alive now. Somewhere in Sullivan and Kingston's network of bought and sold human beings, her twin might be waiting. Not knowing, Abigail was searching for her at last. Abigail. She looked up to find Jackson standing beside her, concern evident in his eyes. We're ready, he said gently. Are you? Abigail rose, straightening her spine. Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within. Let's go. Bennett would ring the church bell at precisely 9 o'clock, drawing attention to a non-existent fire. During the confusion, Jackson and Abigail would enter the courthouse through a seldom-used side entrance Bennett had identified, locate Rose in the cellars, and escape through the same door. It was a simple plan, with countless potential points of failure, but it was all they had. As they prepared to leave, Jackson took Abigail aside, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. Before we do this, he said quietly, there's something you should know. Something Rose told Blackwood, who told me. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Rebecca, my wife, Rose believes she was killed because she discovered the same trafficking network you did, that she was helping women and children escape. Abigail felt a surge of guilt for not sharing this information sooner. Rose told me the same thing. She's Rebecca's cousin. Surprise flickered across Jackson's face. Her cousin, she never mentioned. They were estranged, Abigail explained. Rose only learned of Rebecca's death years later, but she believes Rebecca was targeted specifically because she threatened the network. Jackson absorbed this information, his face hardening with renewed purpose. Then we're fighting the same enemy after all these years. The same corruption that took Rebecca and Hannah from me, that took Sophie from you. Yes? Abigail agreed softly. It seems our paths were meant to cross, though I wish it had been under different circumstances. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed unexpected but undeniable. For a moment, they stood in silence, each finding strength in the other's presence. Then Jackson nodded toward the door. Time to go. They slipped out into the rain-soaked night, moving through shadows toward the courthouse that dominated the town square. The imposing building stood dark except for lights in a few windows, its columns and portico lending it an air of authority that now seemed a cruel mockery, given what they knew of the man who presided within. Positioning themselves in an alley with a clear view of their target, they waited for Bennett's signal. The minutes stretched endlessly, tension building with each passing moment. Then, precisely at 9, the church bell began to toll. Urgent, insistent, a clarion call that cut through the patter of rain. Lights appeared in windows as townspeople were roused by the alarm. Doors opened, voices called questions into the night, and gradually a stream of people began moving toward the church, seeking the source of the emergency. As Bennett had predicted, several guards emerged from the courthouse drawn by the commotion. After a brief consultation, all but one hurried toward the growing crowd at the church. Now, Jackson murmured, leading Abigail toward the side entrance Bennett had described. The door was locked, but Jackson made short work of it with tools Blackwood had provided. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a narrow corridor lined with filing cabinets and legal texts, the administrative heart of Sullivan's domain. "Cellars," Abigail whispered. Bennett said there would be stairs near the back. They moved cautiously through the darkened building, every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet sounding thunderous in the silence. Twice they froze at approaching footsteps, pressing themselves into doorways until the danger passed. Finally, they located a heavy wooden door with a staircase descending into darkness beyond. Jackson drew his revolver, nodding for Abigail to stay behind him as they began their descent. The cellar was cold and damp, illuminated only by a single lantern hanging near the bottom of the stairs. Its flickering light revealed a row of cells with iron bars most empty, but one containing a huddled figure that Abigail recognized with a surge of relief. "Rose!" she called softly, hurrying forward. The woman looked up, her face showing evidence of rough handling, a bruise darkening her cheek, blood dried at the corner of her mouth. But her eyes were clear and alert, widening at the sight of her rescuers. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. "It's a trap." The warning came too late. Light suddenly flooded the cellar as lanterns were lit, revealing armed men positioned in the shadows. At their center stood Judge Malcolm Sullivan, impeccably dressed, despite the late hour, his silver hair and patrician features belying the corruption that had consumed his soul. Beside him stood Garrett, a satisfied smile playing about his lips. "Mr. Reeves," Sullivan said smoothly, addressing Jackson. "Or do you prefer Cole these days? It's been a long time." Jackson's gun was aimed steadily at Sullivan's chest, though he must have known he was hopelessly outnumbered. "Let her go, Malcolm. Your quarrel isn't with Rose Chen." "My quarrel," Sullivan replied, his tone hardening, "is with anyone who threatens the stability I've built in this territory. Miss Chen made her choice when she aided a fugitive." His gaze shifted to Abigail's cold assessment in his eyes. "And you, Miss Hayes, have proven remarkably troublesome for a governess. Kingston warned me you were clever, but I underestimated your resourcefulness." "And your depravity," Abigail retorted, fear giving way to anger. "Selling children for profit. You're a monster hiding behind a judge's robes." Sullivan's expression remained impassive. "Civilization has always been built on commerce, Miss Hayes. The strong prosper, the weak serve. I merely facilitate the natural order." There's nothing natural about tearing children from their families. Abigail's voice shook with suppressed fury. About stealing my sister when she was 5 years old and selling her like property. Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had discovered this particular connection. Ah, yes. The red-haired twin, an exceptional specimen as I recall, fetched a premium price. The casual cruelty of his words struck Abigail like a physical blow. "Where is she?" she demanded. "What happened to Sophie?" Sullivan smiled thinly. "That information might have been negotiable had you approached me directly, rather than stealing from my associate and conspiring against me. Now I'm afraid it dies with you." He nodded to his men. "Take them all. Use the judge's chambers. Fewer questions that way. Make it look like an interrupted burglary. 3 criminals shot while breaking into the courthouse." As the men moved to surround them, Jackson suddenly lunged forward, tackling Sullivan and pressing his revolver to the judge's temple. "Back off!" he shouted to the guards, who froze at the sight of their employer's peril. "Open Rose's cell. Now!" Garrett, who had been watching the confrontation with clinical detachment, slowly drew his own weapon. "You won't leave this building alive, Reeves. You know that." "Maybe not." Jackson acknowledged his grip on Sullivan, unwavering. "But the judge will definitely die first. Your choice." Sullivan, despite his precarious position, maintained his composure. "Do as he says," he instructed one of the guards. "For now." The man hesitated, then moved to unlock Rose's cell. She emerged, cautiously moving to Abigail's side. "The documents," Rose whispered urgently. "Do you still have them?" Abigail nodded, slightly conscious of Garrett's watchful gaze. "Now, what to Reeves?" Sullivan asked, a hint of mockery in his voice, despite the gun at his head. "You've created a temporary stalemate, nothing more. My men surround this building. You have nowhere to go." Before Jackson could respond, a new voice entered the confrontation. "He doesn't need to go anywhere, Judge. You do." Liam Blackwood stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs, shotgun aimed at the guards. Behind him were Pastor Bennett and several townsmen, all armed, their expressions grim with newly awakened determination. "The good people of Redemption have some questions for you." Blackwood continued, satisfaction evident in his tone. "About their missing children, about forged documents, about 20 years of corruption and suffering under your watch." Sullivan's mask of control finally slipped, revealing the rage beneath. "This is absurd. I am the law in this territory. These allegations are true." Abigail interrupted, retrieving the documents from their hiding place. "Every word, written in your own hand, signed with your own signature. Children bought and sold like cattle with you, taking a percentage of each transaction." She handed the papers to Bennett, who began examining them with the townsfolk looking over his shoulder. Murmurs of shock and growing anger filled the cellar. "This proves nothing," Sullivan insisted, desperation entering his voice. "Forgeries, manipulations by a disturbed woman seeking attention." "The ledger entries go back 23 years, Abigail said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence that followed Sullivan's denial. "Including the sale of my twin sister, Sophie Hayes, taken from Boston in 1870. How would I forge details of a transaction I didn't even remember until days ago?" One of the townsmen stepped forward, an older man with grief etched deeply into his face. "My daughter," he said, voice breaking as he pointed to an entry Bennett had just revealed. "Mary, 16 when she disappeared. You told me she'd run off with a traveling man, but here she is in your ledger. Sold to a mine owner in Colorado." Others began to crowd forward, finding names they recognized. Children, siblings, neighbors, long thought simply missing or runaway, now revealed as victims of Sullivan's enterprise. The judge's face had gone ashen, the carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence and the growing fury of the townspeople he had betrayed. "This is a lynch mob," he protested. "I demand proper legal proceedings, a fair trial." "Like the fair proceedings you gave our children," someone shouted from the back. "The legal papers you forged to sell them." The crowd surged forward, only Bennett's raised hands preventing immediate violence. "There will be justice," the pastor assured them. "But it will be proper justice, not vengeance. The territorial governor will receive these documents, and Sullivan will face a court of law for his crimes." Reluctantly, the crowd subsided, though the rage in their eyes remained undiminished. In the momentary calm, Garrett made his move, swift and unexpected. His gun fired once the sound deafening in the confined space, and Jackson staggered back from Sullivan, clutching his side where blood now flowed freely. Abigail cried out, rushing to his side as he collapsed against the wall. Sullivan, freed from Jackson's restraint, straightened his clothing with a return of his former composure. "A valiant attempt," he said coolly, "but ultimately futile. You forget, Pastor, that I control the telegraph office. No messages reach the governor without my approval. By morning, these troublemakers will be dead, these so-called documents destroyed, and order restored." "Not this time, Malcolm." The new voice came from the staircase, older, authoritative, belonging to a tall man in an expensive coat whose bearing suggested both wealth and power. Behind him stood several men wearing federal marshal's badges. Sullivan's face drained of what little color remained. "Governor Carson," he said faintly, This is unexpected." "Clearly," the governor replied dryly. "I received most concerning reports about irregularities in your court. Decided to investigate personally." His gaze swept the cellar, taking in the armed standoff, the wounded Jackson, the incriminating documents. "It seems those reports were understated." Sullivan's calculating mind visibly worked, seeking an escape from his collapsing world. "These people have concocted an elaborate conspiracy against me, Governor. Falsified documents stirred up the rabble with wild accusations. Save it for your trial, Sullivan," Carson cut him off. "Marshals take the judge and his associate into custody. Secure those documents as evidence." As the marshals moved to follow orders, Sullivan's composure finally shattered completely. With a roar of fury, he lunged toward Abigail, perhaps seeking to destroy the damning evidence or simply driven by rage at the woman who had precipitated his downfall. A single shot rang out. Sullivan stumbled, then collapsed, blood spreading across his chest, from a wound that would prove fatal within minutes. All eyes turned to the source of the shot. Blackwood stood with his shotgun still raised, expression grim, but not regretful. "For Thomas," he said simply, "and all the others who never got justice." In the chaos that followed, Abigail remained by Jackson's side, pressing a makeshift bandage against his wound, while Rose examined the damage with professional detachment. "Not fatal," Rose determined, after a careful assessment. "The bullet passed through clean. With proper care, he'll recover." Relief washed through Abigail, followed immediately by renewed concern as Jackson's hand caught hers, his grip surprisingly strong, despite his pallor. "Garrett!" he gasped. "Don't let him!" Abigail looked up suddenly, realizing that in the confusion following Sullivan's death, Garrett had disappeared. She scanned the cellar, frantically catching a glimpse of movement near a dark recess at the far end. A hidden exit, perhaps known only to Sullivan and his closest associate. "He's escaping!" she cried, pointing toward the shadow where Garrett had vanished. Several marshals immediately gave chase, disappearing into the darkness. Whether they would catch him remained to be seen, but Abigail's immediate concern was for Jackson, whose breathing had grown labored, eyes clouding with pain. "Stay with me," she urged, squeezing his hand. "We've won. Sullivan's finished. The evidence is safe." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "Always knew you were stronger than you looked." "Save your strength," Abigail admonished gently. "You'll need it for the journey to Santa Fe." His eyes sought hers, a question in their depths. "Sophie." Abigail swallowed hard, understanding his concern even through his pain. "One step at a time," she said, echoing his own words from days earlier. "First, we get you healed. Then we find my sister." Jackson nodded slightly, his eyes closing as exhaustion claimed him. Abigail remained at his side as the marshals organized the removal of Sullivan's body and the transport of the wounded to the town doctor's house. In the midst of the activity, Governor Carson approached Abigail, his expression grave but respectful. "Miss Hayes," he began, "the territory owes you a tremendous debt. Sullivan's corruption has poisoned our justice system for years. Many suspected, but none had the courage or evidence to stand against him." "I had help," Abigail replied, glancing toward Rose, who was assisting with Jackson's care, and Bennett, who was calming the still agitated townspeople. "And motivation." She hesitated, then asked the question burning in her heart. "Governor, the ledgers mention my sister, Sophie Hayes, taken from Boston 23 years ago. Is there any way to trace her, to find where she might be now?" Carson's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "We'll do everything possible, Miss Hayes. Sullivan's records are extensive. If your sister is anywhere in the territory, we'll find her." It wasn't the certainty she craved, but it was hope, more than she'd had for most of her life. As Jackson was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, Abigail walked beside him, her hand still clasped in his. The rain had stopped, stars emerging in the clearing sky above Redemption. A town beginning its long journey toward healing from the cancer that had grown within it for decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. But tonight, in this moment, they had achieved what had seemed impossible days ago. Exposed Sullivan's corruption, secured evidence of his crimes, and taken the first step toward justice for countless victims. And perhaps, just perhaps, toward finding Sophie at last. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity, questioning, and healing. Jackson was installed in the town doctor's home, his wound treated with all the skill available in Redemption. Though fever set in briefly, Rose's herbal knowledge, combined with the doctor's more conventional treatments, soon brought it under control. Abigail divided her time between Jackson's bedside and consultations with Governor Carson and the federal marshals, who were methodically dismantling Sullivan's network, using the evidence she had provided. The ledgers proved even more damning than initially realized, implicating not just Kingston in Chicago, but associates throughout the Western territories, a web of corruption and human trafficking spanning decades. Garrett had escaped the immediate pursuit, but his description had been telegraphed to law enforcement across the territory. With his distinctive appearance and mannerisms, it seemed only a matter of time before he was apprehended. On the afternoon of the third day, Abigail sat by Jackson's window, watching the activity in the street below. Redemption was transforming the shock of Sullivan's exposure, giving way to a community's determination to reckon with its past and forge a better future. "You should rest." Jackson's voice came from the bed, stronger now than it had been since the shooting. Abigail turned to find him watching, her color returning to his face, though pain still lingered in his eyes. I could say the same to you, she replied with a small smile. The doctor says you're the worst patient he's ever had. Doctors exaggerate, Jackson dismissed, though his attempt to sit up ended in a grimace that belied his nonchalance. Any word on Garrett? Abigail shook her head. Nothing yet, but the marshals are confident they'll find him. He can't have gone far on foot, and his face is now known throughout the territory. Jackson nodded, his expression troubled. And Sophie, any progress? The question touched the wound in Abigail's heart that remained raw despite their victory over Sullivan. Governor Carson has assigned men to review all the records. They've traced several children from the early entries, but she swallowed hard. No sign of Sophie yet. The trail goes cold after her initial sale. Jackson reached out his hand, finding hers in a gesture that had become natural between them. We'll find her, Abigail, however long it takes. The simple promise, the use of we rather than you, warmed her even as doubt clouded her hope. After 23 years, what were the chances Sophie was still alive? And if she was, would she even remember her twin? The family torn from her when she was barely old enough to form lasting memories. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Rose entered, carrying a tray with fresh bandages and herbal preparations for Jackson's wound. The doctor says you're healing well, she informed him, setting down her supplies, though your stubborn insistence on moving about isn't helping matters. I've had worse, Jackson replied, submitting with poor grace to her ministrations. Yes, you have, Rose agreed matter-of-factly. But that's no reason to invite further injury through impatience. As she worked changing the bandages with practiced efficiency, Abigail noticed the easy familiarity that had developed between them, a connection formed through their shared link to Rebecca perhaps, or simply the natural kinship of two private, self-sufficient souls who recognized those qualities in each other. Any news from the governor's men? Rose asked Abigail as she finished tending to Jackson. They've identified most of the children from the recent entries, Abigail replied. Some already rescued, others being located now, but the older records are more difficult. People move, names change. Rose nodded, understanding. Time blurs many trails, but not all. She hesitated, then added, There's someone here to see you. A woman who arrived with the governor's party from Santa Fe. She's been helping with the records. Another investigator? Abigail asked. Not exactly. Rose's expression held something Abigail couldn't quite interpret. She specifically asked for you. Says she has information about a child taken from Boston many years ago. Abigail's heart leapt, hope and fear mingling in equal measure. Sophie, she knows about Sophie. She wouldn't say more, only that she needed to speak with you directly. Rose glanced at Jackson. She's waiting in the parlor downstairs, if you feel up to seeing her. Abigail was already rising, her hand slipping from Jackson's grasp. Of course. I'll go now. Jackson caught her wrist gently. Whatever you learn, he said quietly, remember, you're not alone in this anymore. The simple reassurance steadied her. Abigail nodded, then followed Rose downstairs to the doctor's modest parlor, where a woman stood gazing out the window at the street beyond. She turned as Abigail entered, a tall, slender figure, perhaps in her early 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and a bearing that suggested both education and authority. Something in her features struck Abigail as vaguely familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Miss Hayes, the woman said, her voice cultured but warm. Thank you for seeing me. My name is Margaret Winters. I work with the Pinkerton Agency in Chicago, specializing in cases involving missing children. You have information about my sister, Abigail asked directly, too anxious for social niceties. Margaret's expression softened. Please sit down. What I have to tell you is complicated. Abigail complied reluctantly, perching on the edge of a chair while Margaret seated herself opposite, hands folded in her lap, with practiced composure. "For the past 15 years," Margaret began, "I've been tracking a network of child traffickers operating throughout the Midwest and Western territories. My interest began as personal. My own daughter was taken when she was 4 years old." Sympathy momentarily displaced Abigail's impatience. "I'm so sorry. Did you ever find her?" "No," Margaret replied, pain briefly visible beneath her professional demeanor. "But in searching, I discovered hundreds of similar cases. Children vanishing from good homes, from orphanages, from immigrant communities. Anywhere they wouldn't be missed, or where their disappearance could be easily explained away." "Sullivan's network," Abigail surmised. "Yes, though I didn't know his name until recently. The organization was careful compartmentalized. Local operators like Kingston in Chicago, Judge Sullivan here in the territory, others elsewhere, all connected but insulated from one another." Margaret opened a small portfolio she had brought with her, removing several documents. "When Governor Carson telegraphed about the discovery of Sullivan's ledgers, I came immediately. The records you found may be the key to unraveling the entire operation, not just the New Mexico branch." "But Sophie," Abigail pressed, unable to contain her urgency any longer. "Do you know what happened to her? Is she alive?" Margaret hesitated, compassion evident in her expression. "Miss Hayes, Abigail, before I answer that question, I need to ask you something. The ledger entry for Sophie Hayes taken from Boston in 1870. It described her as having red hair and green eyes, correct?" "Yes." Abigail confirmed, puzzled by the question. "We were identical twins, except for our hair color. Mine was brown, hers bright red. Unusual enough that she was targeted specifically, it seems." "And your parents? They searched for her?" "For years," Abigail replied, the old pain surfacing. "It destroyed them. My father drank himself to death eventually. My mother retreated into laudanum addiction. I was raised largely by relatives after that." Margaret nodded, as if confirming something she already suspected. "And you have no memory of what happened that day when Sophie was taken?" "I was 5. Abigail said, growing increasingly confused by this line of questioning. "I remember playing in the yard. A man asked for directions. I went inside to get my father. When I came back, Sophie was gone." Margaret was silent for a long moment, studying Abigail's face with an intensity that became uncomfortable. Finally she spoke again, her voice gentler than before. "Abigail, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I believe you deserve the truth, however painful." A sense of foreboding settled over Abigail. "Just tell me, please." "Sophie Hayes wasn't taken by traffickers," Margaret said quietly. "She was rescued from them." The words made no sense. Abigail shook her head in confusion. "I don't understand. The man who came to your home that day wasn't looking for Sophie. He was looking for you." Margaret's gaze held Abigail's steadily. "You were the one with red hair, Abigail. You were the one they had marked for taking. But when the moment came, your sister, your brave, protective sister, pretended to be you. She answered to your name, went with the man voluntarily to spare you his attention." The room seemed to tilt around Abigail, the foundations of her understanding crumbling. "No," she whispered, "that's not possible. I would remember. I would know if the mind protects itself." Margaret said, gently echoing Jackson's words from days earlier. "Especially a child's mind. The trauma of watching your sister sacrifice herself for you, followed by your parents' grief and eventual destruction." It was too much. So your mind reversed the roles, made Sophie the victim and yourself the survivor with the burden of guilt. You're wrong, Abigail insisted, rising shakily to her feet. I am Abigail Hayes. I've always been Abigail Hayes. No, Margaret countered softly. You were born Sophie Hayes. You became Abigail after your sister was taken, assuming her identity perhaps initially to comfort your grieving parents, then eventually believing it yourself. She removed a final document from her portfolio, a yellowed newspaper clipping with a photograph of two small girls identical except for their hair color. The caption identified them as Abigail Left and Sophie Hayes, daughters of Professor James Hayes of Boston. The child on the left had dark hair. The child on the right, the one labeled Sophie, had Abigail's own face, but with bright red hair. The evidence was undeniable, yet Abigail's mind rebelled against it. How can you possibly know this, after 23 years? Because I found her, Margaret replied simply. The real Abigail Hayes. 6 years ago, working as a teacher in Denver under the name Margaret Winters, my name, which I gave her when I adopted her 15 years ago. The revelation struck Abigail like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, struggling to process what she was hearing. You adopted my sister. Margaret nodded. After rescuing her from a household in St. Louis, where she had been placed as a companion to the daughter of a wealthy merchant. In reality, she was little more than a servant, though luckier than many children in the network. When I found her, she was 13, had no memory of her birth family, and called herself Mary. And she's alive? Abigail's voice broke on the question. Abigail, my sister, she's alive. Very much so, Margaret confirmed with a gentle smile. She became my assistant in the Pinkerton agency after finishing her education. She's dedicated her life to finding and rescuing trafficked children driven by a past she couldn't quite remember, but that shaped her nonetheless. Where is she now? Abigail asked, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Margaret's smile widened slightly. Waiting at my hotel. She wasn't sure you would want to see her after all this time, after all the confusion about your identities. Of course I want to see her, Abigail, no Sophie, whispered. She's my sister, my twin, the other half of myself I've been missing all these years. Rising on unsteady legs, she moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to Margaret. Does she know about the switch that I've been living as Abigail all this time? She suspected when we found the ledger entry, Margaret replied. The description matched what she remembered of herself as a child, not what she remembered of you. But memory is a fragile thing, especially childhood memory distorted by trauma. Abigail nodded, her world still spinning with the revelation. I need to tell Jackson, she said. Before I see her, he should understand what's happening. Of course, Margaret agreed. Take whatever time you need. We'll be at the hotel when you're ready. Abigail made her way back upstairs in a daze. Her identity, the very foundation of her self-understanding, shattered and reforming with each step. She wasn't Abigail Hayes, the sister left behind to bear the guilt of survival. She was Sophie Hayes, the intended victim, whose sister had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her. And that sister was alive, waiting to reunite after 23 years of separation and mistaken identities. Jackson looked up as she entered his room, alarm spreading across his features at her evident distress. What happened? What did she tell you? Abigail sank onto the chair beside his bed, words failing her momentarily. Finally, she managed to speak, her voice scarcely above a whisper. I'm not Abigail, she said. I'm Sophie. I always have been, my sister, the real Abigail. She took my place when they came for me, pretended to be me so they would take her instead. Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes, followed by deep compassion. And you switched places in your mind, became Abigail to survive the guilt. How could I not remember something so fundamental? She asked the question directed as much at herself as at him. How could I live someone else's life for 23 years and not know it? The mind does what it must to survive, Jackson said gently. You were 5 years old, faced with something no child should ever experience. Is it any wonder you found a way to make it bearable? He reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. This doesn't change who you are. Abigail Sophie. The name matters less than the woman I've come to know. Brave, determined, compassionate. That's you, whatever you call yourself. His simple acceptance steadied her, providing an anchor in the storm of her shattered identity. She's alive, Jackson. My sister is alive. She's here in redemption. Then go to her, he urged. Don't waste another moment apart. Will you come with me? She asked suddenly, fearful of facing this momentous reunion alone. Jackson's expression softened. If the doctor permits it, yes. This isn't a moment you should face alone. An hour later, with the reluctant approval of the doctor and the assistance of Rose and Bennett, Jackson was dressed and supported between them as they made their way to the hotel where Margaret Winters waited, with the woman who had been born Abigail Hayes, but had lived most of her life under other names. The lobby was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the large windows. Margaret met them at the entrance, her expression warm with approval at seeing them together. She's in the small parlor, Margaret informed them, leading the way. She's nervous, afraid you might resent her for the deception, though it wasn't intentional on either part. Never, Sophie assured her, still struggling to think of herself by her true name after a lifetime as Abigail. How could I resent the sister who sacrificed herself for me? Margaret opened the door to a private sitting room where a woman stood by the window, her back to the door. At the sound of their entrance, she turned slowly. For Sophie, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just her features, but the path her life might have taken under different circumstances. The woman before her had her face, older, more weathered by experience than the child in her fractured memories, but unmistakably her twin. Her hair was auburn, rather than the bright red of childhood streaked with early silver at the temples. But her eyes, Sophie's own eyes, regarded her with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Abigail, Sophie whispered, using her sister's true name perhaps for the first time in 23 years. Sophie, her twin replied, her voice breaking on the name. They moved toward each other as if drawn by invisible forces, stopping just short of contact, each studying the other's face with wonder and disbelief. You were so brave, Sophie said, tears flowing freely now. To go in my place, to save me. I wasn't brave, Abigail contradicted gently. Just a child who loved her sister and saw a bad man looking at her with evil intent. I didn't think about consequences. I just acted. All these years I thought I was you, that you were the one taken. And I forgot who I was entirely, Abigail replied. Became Mary, then Margaret's daughter, then, finally, myself again, though I never knew my true name until the ledgers were found. They reached for each other simultaneously, embracing with the desperation of those who have been separated far too long. In that moment, something long broken in both women began to heal. The fractured memories aligning, the misplaced identities finding their proper homes. Jackson, watching from the doorway with Rose and Bennett, felt his own eyes grow damp at the sight. The sisters' reunion represented everything their long struggle had been for, not just justice for Sullivan's crimes, but the restoration of what had been stolen. Not just lives saved, but lives reclaimed. As the sisters finally separated, Abigail looked past Sophie to where Jackson stood supported by his friends. "You must be Jackson Reeves," she said, approaching him with her hand extended. "My sister has told me about you in her letters, about your courage, your determination to see justice done." Jackson accepted her hand, studying her face with undisguised wonder at the miracle of the twins reunited. "Your sister is the courageous one," he corrected. "I just followed her lead." "Then we have that in common," Abigail said with a smile that transformed her serious features. "Following Sophie's lead has always been my destiny, it seems, even when neither of us knew it." The reunion continued into the evening, the sisters sharing stories of their separate lives, piecing together the fragments of memory each had preserved, reconstructing their shared past with newfound understanding. Margaret provided context from her years investigating the trafficking network, while Jackson contributed insights from his own experiences with Sullivan and the territorial justice system. As night fell, Sophie found herself sitting beside Jackson near the window, watching her sister deep in conversation with Margaret and Bennett across the room. "How does it feel?" Jackson asked quietly, "finding her after all these years?" "Like waking from a dream," Sophie replied thoughtfully. "Or perhaps entering one. I'm not sure yet which is real, my life as Abigail or this new existence as Sophie." "Both are real," Jackson said. "Both are parts of you. The name changes, but the essence remains." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing beyond the gruff exterior to the man beneath. The man who had saved her in the forest, taught her to survive, stood beside her, against seemingly insurmountable odds. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Kingston still at large in Chicago, Garrett unaccounted for." "Justice continues," Jackson replied simply. "The governor has already telegraphed authorities in Chicago. Kingston won't escape scrutiny now that Sullivan's records have been exposed." "And us?" Sophie ventured the question, carrying weight beyond the immediate future. "What happens to us, Jackson?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze meeting hers directly. "That depends on what you want, Sophie Hayes. Your sister has offered you a place with the Pinkerton Agency, continuing the work of finding and rescuing trafficked children. It's meaningful work that suits your courage and determination." "And if that's not what I want?" she pressed gently. A hint of vulnerability entered Jackson's expression. "Then perhaps there's a place for you in New Mexico territory. A new life building on the foundation of the old. Not easy, but real," Sophie finished for him. "Honest, with purpose." "Yeah." The simple affirmation hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Sophie glanced across the room at her sister, feeling the pull of their newly rediscovered connection, a bond that transcended time, distance, and fractured memories. "I don't have to decide tonight," she said finally. "For now, it's enough to have found her, to have found myself. The rest can wait until wounds have healed and paths become clearer." Jackson nodded understanding in his eyes. "One step at a time," he quoted with a small smile. "First healing, then justice, then whatever comes next." "Together," Sophie added, her hand finding his. "Together." Jackson agreed, his fingers closing around hers with gentle strength. Outside, stars wheeled across the New Mexico sky, their ancient light illuminating a world forever changed by the courage of those who refused to surrender to darkness. Whether the darkness of corrupted power or the deeper shadows of buried memory, and lost identity. For Sophie Hayes, formerly Abigail, the journey had come full circle. She had entered redemption seeking justice and evidence of her sister's fate. She would leave it with her true name restored, her sister found, and a future opening before her, rich with possibilities she had never dared imagine. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe stood imposing against the clear blue sky, its adobe walls and territorial architecture a stark contrast to the wooden structures of redemption. 2 weeks had passed since Sullivan's death and the exposure of his trafficking network, weeks filled with healing revelations and the painstaking work of justice. Inside the main courtroom, Governor Carson presided over a special inquiry established to document the full extent of Sullivan's crimes and determine appropriate restitution for his victims. The room was packed with witnesses, survivors, officials, and ordinary citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Sophie sat in the front row beside Abigail, both women dressed simply but formally for the occasion. Behind them were Jackson, still moving carefully due to his healing wound, Rose Chen, Pastor Bennett, and Liam Blackwood, the unlikely allies whose combined efforts had brought down Sullivan's empire. At a table before the governor's bench sat Garrett, captured 3 days earlier, attempting to cross into Colorado territory. His elegant attire was now replaced by prison garb, his cold composure fractured by the knowledge that his testimony was his only hope of avoiding the gallows. "But, Garrett," Governor Carson addressed him sternly, "you have agreed to provide complete information regarding Harrison Kingston's operation in Chicago in exchange for consideration in your sentencing. Is that correct?" "It is, Governor," Garrett replied, his voice subdued but still carrying its cultured tone. "Then proceed. The court is particularly interested in the full extent of the trafficking network, the disposition of children taken over the past 25 years, and the identities of all officials who facilitated or profited from these crimes." Garrett glanced briefly at Sophie and Abigail before beginning his testimony. The operation began approximately 30 years ago, initially trafficking adult women for households and brothels. Kingston's father was the founder with Sullivan as an early partner handling the legal aspects. When the elder Kingston died, Harrison expanded into children, recognizing the higher profits and decreased scrutiny. For the next 2 hours, Garrett detailed the workings of the network, the procurement methods, the distribution channels, the bribes paid to officials across multiple states and territories. His clinical precision made the horror all the more profound, reducing human suffering to ledger entries and profit margins. Sophie listened with growing coldness, her hand occasionally tightening around Abigail's or Jackson's when the testimony touched on particularly painful aspects of the operation. This was the machine that had stolen her sister, that had created the fracture in their lives that even reunion couldn't fully heal. When Garrett described the process of selection, identifying children with particular attributes desired by wealthy clients, Abigail rose abruptly and left the courtroom. Sophie moved to follow, but Jackson caught her arm gently. "Let me," he murmured. "This is harder for her than she'll admit. She remembers more than you do." Sophie nodded, watching as Jackson followed her sister into the corridor beyond. Their relationship had developed its own unique dynamic over the past weeks. Survivors bound by shared trauma, each protective of the other in different ways. Garrett's testimony continued, eventually reaching the specific case that had begun the investigation. "Regarding the Hayes twins," he stated, glancing again at Sophie, "that was before my time with the organization. But according to Kingston's records, the intended target was the red-haired child, Sophie. The other girl's intervention was unexpected, created complications." "What kind of complications?" Governor Carson pressed. Switched identities. The ledger listed Sophie Hayes as procured, but it was actually Abigail who was taken. The mistake wasn't discovered until later, but by then it was deemed too risky to correct. The child had already been placed with a client in St. Louis. Sophie closed her eyes briefly, the confirmation of Margaret's theory, bringing both clarity and renewed pain. Her sister had not only sacrificed herself, but had endured years of servitude under Sophie's name, a final cruelty in an already unforgivable crime. When Garrett finished his testimony, the governor called a recess, promising to reconvene with additional witnesses the following day. As the courtroom emptied, Sophie found herself approached by Margaret Winters, whose expression held both sympathy and purpose. "You held up well," Margaret observed. "It's not easy hearing such things, especially when they touch so personally on your own history." "It helps to have Abigail here," Sophie replied. "To know that despite everything Garrett and Kingston did, we found each other again." Margaret nodded, understanding. "Have you given any thought to my offer? The Pinkerton Agency could use someone with your insight and determination. Your sister has been invaluable in our work rescuing trafficking victims." Sophie hesitated, the question touching on decisions not yet fully formed in her mind. "I'm still considering all possibilities," she said diplomatically. "There's much to weigh." Of course, Margaret accepted, though her keen eyes suggested she understood more than Sophie had articulated. "Just know the opportunity remains open whenever you're ready." As they spoke, Jackson returned his expression, suggesting concern. "Abigail needed some air," he explained. "Bennett's with her now. She'll be all right, just needed space from Garrett's clinical descriptions." "I should go to her," Sophie said, moving toward the door. "Actually," Jackson stopped her gently. "She asked for a few minutes alone, said she'd meet us at the hotel later." He hesitated, then added, "She also suggested you and I might want to visit the Territorial Land Office while we're here, said you'd understand why." Puzzled, Sophie allowed Jackson to escort her from the courthouse into the bright Santa Fe afternoon. They walked in comfortable silence toward the land office several blocks away, each lost in their own thoughts. The land office was quiet, the clerk behind the counter looking up with mild interest as they entered. Jackson approached, presenting papers Sophie hadn't seen before. "I'd like to register a land claim," he said, his tone casual, though something in his manner suggested the request was far from ordinary. The clerk examined the documents, nodding approval. "Everything seems in order, Mr. Reeves. The governor's endorsement carries significant weight. I'll process these immediately." "Land claim?" Sophie questioned when they were outside again. "What was that about?" Jackson's expression held a mixture of uncertainty and hope that she found endearing in a man usually so self-contained. "After Sullivan's death, several properties were seized by the Territory, including his ranch near Silver Creek. Good land, solid house, better than my place near Redemption." "And you're claiming it?" Sophie was still confused by the connection to Abigail's suggestion. "We are," Jackson corrected quietly. "If you want it." Abigail thought, well, she thought you might be considering staying in the Territory, that you might need a place to build something new. Understanding dawned. "A fresh start," Sophie said softly. "Away from both our pasts." "Something like that." Jackson's gaze met hers directly. "I know you have options, Sophie. The Pinkerton Agency with your sister. Return to Chicago and your life there. This is just another possibility." The offer touched her deeply, not just for its practicality, but for what it represented. Jackson Reeves, the man who had lived in isolation for a decade, was offering to share his life, his future. Not with grand declarations or demands, but with the simple gift of possibility. "I'd like to see it," she said finally. Before deciding, relief and pleasure mingled in Jackson's smile. We can ride out tomorrow after the inquiry concludes. It's about half a day's journey. They returned to the hotel to find Abigail waiting in the lobby, her composure restored, though shadows lingered in her eyes. Beside her stood Rose Chen, whose presence in Santa Fe had initially been to testify, but had expanded to include caring for Jackson's still-healing wound. "Did you visit the land office?" Abigail asked, a knowing look passing between her and Jackson. "We did," Sophie confirmed, studying her sister curiously. "You knew about this." "Jackson mentioned it yesterday," Abigail admitted. "Asked my opinion. I thought you should have options beyond the Pinkerton agency." She smiled slightly. "Though I'll admit to selfish motives as well. If you stay in the territory, I'll have more reason to visit regularly." "You wouldn't consider staying yourself?" Sophie asked, though she suspected the answer. Abigail shook her head gently. "My work is with Margaret now. There are still so many children in the network, Sophie. Kingston's operation in Chicago was just one branch. Now that we have Garrett's testimony and Sullivan's records, we can expand our efforts." "The work never ends," Rose observed with quiet understanding. "No," Abigail agreed. "But it matters. Every child found every family reunited. It matters." The conviction in her voice spoke volumes about the woman she had become, shaped by her own experiences as a trafficked child, driven by the desire to prevent others from suffering similar fates. In that moment, Sophie saw her sister's path with perfect clarity, a calling as true and necessary as any. "We're different that way," Sophie said thoughtfully. "You need to keep moving, fighting the larger battle. I think I need to stay in one place, build something lasting." "We were always different, even as identical twins," Abigail replied with a smile. "You were always the one who wanted to put down roots, create a home. I was always restless, looking toward the horizon." The insight struck Sophie as profoundly true, though she hadn't articulated it even to herself until now. Her work as a governess, her desire for stability, these weren't just practical choices, but expressions of her deepest nature. "Whatever you decide," Abigail continued, "we won't lose each other again. I promise you that." The following day brought the conclusion of Garrett's testimony and the formal charges against him. Multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy that would ensure he spent the remainder of his life in territorial prison. Kingston had been arrested in Chicago, based on the evidence provided, and similar proceedings were underway in courts across multiple states and territories as Sullivan's network unraveled. As they left the courthouse for the final time, a sense of completion settled over Sophie. Justice had been served insofar as human justice could address crimes of such magnitude. Sullivan was dead. Garrett imprisoned Kingston, facing trial. The children still in the system were being identified and, where possible, returned to their families or placed in proper homes. Yet beneath this resolution lay the deeper, more personal question of what came next. Not just for the victims and survivors, but for Sophie herself. The identity she had carried for 23 years had been revealed as a construct. The sister she had mourned was found. The future she had envisioned was now open to reconsideration. That afternoon, as promised, Jackson took her to see Sullivan's former property. They rode in a borrowed wagon, the journey giving them time to talk about practicalities, the potential of the land, the condition of the house, the work required to transform a corrupt judge's retreat into a true home. "It's just over this rise," Jackson said as they approached a gentle slope covered with pinon pine and juniper. "Best grazing land in the territory according to those who know such things." As they crested the hill, the property came into view. A substantial adobe house nestled against protective cliffs, with a barn corral and outbuildings arranged in a practical configuration. A small stream ran along one edge of the cleared land, providing water even in the driest seasons. It was beautiful in the way of the New Mexico highlands, stark yet nurturing, demanding yet rewarding. Sophie could immediately see both its current reality and its potential. "It's perfect," she said simply, as Jackson helped her down from the wagon. "It needs work," he cautioned, though pleasure at her reaction was evident in his voice. Sullivan didn't maintain it as well as he might have. Too busy with his other enterprises. "All the better," Sophie replied. "I'd rather build something new than live in anything he created." They walked the property together, Jackson pointing out features and possibilities, Sophie asking questions and offering suggestions. It felt natural, this shared assessment, this mutual planning, as if they had been partners for years rather than weeks. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land, they found themselves on the wide porch that wrapped around three sides of the house. The view stretched for miles, rolling hills giving way to distant peaks, the vast New Mexico sky beginning to glow with the approaching sunset. "I could be happy here," Sophie said, voicing the conclusion that had been forming throughout the afternoon. "Not forgetting the past, but not defined by it either, building something worthwhile." Jackson, leaning against a porch post, watched her with an expression that mingled hope with careful restraint. "It's a big decision. You should take time, be certain." Sophie turned to face him, fully appreciating his concern, but recognizing the moment for what it was. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a conclusion, but a choice. "Some decisions don't require time," she said quietly. "Just clarity. I know who I am now, Jackson. I know what I want." "And what is that?" he asked, his voice dropping to match her softer tone. "A home," Sophie replied simply. "Work that matters. People to care for and be cared by. A life that honors what was lost without being consumed by it." She paused, then added with gentle directness, "And you, if you're willing to share this new beginning." The restraint in Jackson's expression gave way to something deeper, more vulnerable than she had yet seen in him. "I'm willing," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of promise. "More than willing. But you should know, I'm not an easy man, Sophie. The past has left its marks, not all of them visible." "We all have scars," she acknowledged. "Mine are no less deep for being hidden in memory and identity rather than written on skin. But perhaps that's what makes this possible. We understand each other's wounds without needing to explain them." He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "So we do this, make something new here." "Yes," Sophie said, certainty filling her voice. "We make something new, not just for ourselves, but for others who need what we can offer." "Others?" Jackson questioned, though his expression suggested he already understood her meaning. "Children like my sister and I were. Women fleeing situations like those Rebecca tried to help. People needing safety, healing, a chance to rebuild." Sophie gestured toward the spacious house and surrounding land. "There's room here for more than just two people, Jackson. Room to continue the work that brought us together, but in our own way." Understanding and approval dawned in his eyes. "A sanctuary." "Yes," Sophie confirmed. "A place of redemption in the truest sense of the word." The name settled between them, perfect in its simplicity and meaning. Not redemption, the town built on hypocrisy and corruption, but redemption, the process. The reclaiming of what was lost, the restoration of what was broken, the transformation of suffering into purpose. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber, Jackson moved closer, his hand finding hers with the ease of long familiarity. "It won't be easy," he cautioned one final time. "Creating something like this." Sophie's fingers intertwined with his, the contact, both comfort and promise. The worthwhile things rarely are. Together, they watched the sun's descent, the shadows lengthening across what would become their home, their sanctuary, their shared future. Behind them lay paths of pain and loss, mistaken identities, and brutal revelations. Before them stretched possibility, undefined but rich, with potential challenging, but free from the burdens that had for so long defined their separate journeys. 2 weeks later, Abigail departed for Chicago with Margaret Winters, the wagon that took them to the Santa Fe station, loaded with copies of Sullivan's records and Garrett's testimony, ammunition for their continued fight against the trafficking network. The sisters' farewell was emotional, but not final. Both secure in the knowledge that their bond, once restored, would not be broken again by distance or circumstance. "You'll write," Abigail insisted, embracing Sophie on the station platform. "Every week, and I'll visit whenever cases bring me west." "Of course," Sophie assured her. "And when the sanctuary is established, you'll send us those who need it most." "I will." Abigail stepped back, studying her sister's face with a mixture of joy and lingering amazement at their reunion. "You're happy here. I can see it." "I am," Sophie confirmed, glancing toward Jackson, who waited respectfully nearby. "It feels right, Abigail, like the path I was always meant to find." "Then I'm happy for you," Abigail said simply. "For both of you." As the train pulled away, Sophie and Jackson returned to the wagon that would take them back to their new home. Still in the early stages of renovation, still more potential than reality, but already beginning to fulfill the vision they had conceived on that sunset-painted porch. Rose Chen had agreed to relocate her apothecary to a small building on the property, bringing her medical knowledge and quiet wisdom to their endeavor. Pastor Bennett had promised regular visits, offering spiritual guidance to those who sought it. Even Blackwood, though maintaining his solitary existence in the mountains, had pledged his support and protection for the sanctuary and its inhabitants. The first residents would arrive the following week. 2 sisters, ages 8 and 10, rescued from a mining camp, where they had been sold as helpers but treated as slaves. Others would follow as word spread through Margaret's network and the territorial authorities' ongoing investigations into Sullivan's former operation. Each would find at the sanctuary not just safety, but purpose, not just shelter, but community. Each would discover, as Sophie had, that identity was not fixed but fluid, that the past informed but need not determine the future, that redemption was possible even from the darkest of circumstances. As they crested the familiar rise and the property came into view, Sophie felt a sense of homecoming deeper than any she had known before. Not the false security of her life as Abigail Hayes, nor the uncertain belonging of her position with the Kingstons, but a true recognition of where and with whom she was meant to be. Beside her, Jackson guided the horses with practiced ease, his expression peaceful in a way it hadn't been when they first met. The shadows of his past, Rebecca's death, his years of violence and revenge, his decade of isolation, hadn't disappeared, but they had receded, balanced now by new purpose and unexpected joy. "Home," he said simply as they approached. Sophie nodded, the word encompassing far more than the physical structures before them. "Home." She echoed, her hand finding his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The New Mexico sun bathed the landscape in golden light, the mountains stood sentinel against the horizon, and the future stretched before them. Not perfect, not without challenge, but rich with possibility and purpose. And in that moment, for Sophie Hayes and Jackson Reeves, redemption was not just a place or a process, but a reality at last achieved.